I thought my life was perfect. I finished university and got a job at the company I always wanted to work for. After graduating, I met my husband Mark, and we got married when I was 25. Mark had a good job, and he was a kind and caring person. 3 years into our marriage, we had our daughter, Lily. Mark and I loved our time together, so when we found out I was pregnant, we were excited to welcome our little girl. It felt like perfect timing. Life was going great, or so I thought. My name is Sarah. I'm 30 years old and a stay-at-home mom. I quit my job when Lily was born because I wanted to focus on raising her. Now she's almost 2, and she's the sweetest child. She makes me smile every day, and watching her grow brings me so much happiness. Mark adores Lily too. On weekends, he takes care of her so I can rest. Thanks to his help, I've been able to keep a good balance in my life. But one day, everything changed. It happened on a weekend when Mark's parents, Richard and Diane, suddenly showed up at our house. Until then, I only saw them a few times a year. To be honest, I never really liked Diane. And I knew she didn't like me either. When Mark and I got engaged, she said, "I'm not sure she's the right woman for my son." She also made rude comments like, "She doesn't seem like she was raised properly." I never stayed quiet though. I always clapped back. Maybe Mark likes me because I'm positive and easygoing. Unlike you. Mark and his dad, Richard, hated arguments, so they always tried to stop me from talking back. Diane and I never got along from the start. So why did they suddenly come over? Even though I was confused, I had no choice but to let them in. "Hi, Richard and Diane. What brings you here today?" "What? Are you serious? We told you we were coming." "Huh. Sarah, I'm so sorry," Mark said. "I forgot to tell you my parents were coming." How could he forget to tell me something so important? Mark was always a little forgetful. Still, I quickly made tea for everyone. "So what's the reason for your visit?" I asked. "What? Mark didn't tell you. We talked to him before." "Sarah, do you and Mark even communicate properly?" Diane said with a smirk. I ignored her and looked at Mark. He looked nervous before finally speaking. "The thing is, I talked to my parents and we decided to move in with them." "What? Remember? My dad broke his leg the other day. Ever since then, I've been worried about him. Also, they're getting older. I think it's best if we move in and take care of them." "Wait, so you already decided we're moving in?" "Oh yeah, I think it's the right thing to do." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Just because Mark thought it was a good idea didn't mean he could make this decision without talking to me first. "Sarah, don't tell me you're against this," Diane said. "Either way, your opinion doesn't matter. We only care about what Mark wants. This is an important decision for both of us," I said firmly. "I need to talk it over with Mark first." Diane gave me a sharp look, like she was annoyed, then left with Richard. As soon as they were gone, I turned to Mark. "Why didn't you tell me about this?" I asked. "I can't believe you tried to make such a big decision without talking to me first." "I am sorry," Mark mumbled. "I was just worried about my dad." "Being worried about your dad is understandable, but you should have talked to me first." "You're right, I should have." Mark took a deep breath before asking, "So what do you think? Would you consider moving in with them?" "Honestly? No, I don't get along with your mom." "I knew you'd say that," Mark sighed. "Is there anything that would change your mind?" "I'll do it under one condition." "What is it?" "You have to stand up for me. If your mom picks on me or treats me badly, you have to defend me. If you can't do that, then we're getting a divorce." "Divorce? Isn't that a little extreme?" "I'm serious. That's how much I dislike your mother. If you can't promise to stand up for me, I'll leave and go back to my parents' house." "Oh, okay. I promise I'll stand up for you. Just please don't say you'll divorce me." Since Mark made that promise, I agreed to move in with his parents for now. Of course, if he ever broke that promise, I would leave immediately. A few weeks later, we moved in with Richard and Diane. The moment Diane greeted us, she coldly said, "Oh, you're finally here. Well, just try not to cause any trouble." And she said it with such a sarcastic tone. I lightly nudged Mark, who was standing beside me. Looking nervous, he quickly spoke up. "Mom, you're the one who asked us to move in. You should treat us well too, so please don't give us any trouble either." Diane looked surprised for a second, but quickly went back to her usual expression. "Well, fine. Come on in. I'll make you some tea." I was glad Mark actually stood up for me. If he kept doing that, Maybe I could handle living with Diane. After unpacking our things, I was having tea with Richard and Diane in the living room when I heard the front door open. I turned toward the entrance, wondering who it was. Then I saw Olivia, Mark's younger sister. "I'm home," she called out. "Oh, are Mark and his family visiting today?" she asked. "Yes, that's what I told you yesterday," Diane replied. I was confused. "Is Olivia living here?" I thought. I always assumed she had her own place. Then why did she say, "I'm home"? Was she just visiting, or was she actually living here? Olivia, it's been a while," I said. "Oh, hey Sarah. We're all one big family now, right? Wait, are you living here now?" "Huh. Didn't Mark tell you? I moved back 3 months ago." "Mark never mentioned this to me." I turned to glare at him. "Oh no, I forgot to tell you," he mumbled. Strike one. 2 more strikes, and he's out. "Oh, I see. I didn't know," I said. "Well, we're all family now," Olivia said cheerfully. Later, when we were alone in our room, I gave Mark an earful. And just like that, life in Diane's house began. As expected, it didn't take long for Diane to start treating me badly. "Sarah, why aren't you cleaning?" she suddenly asked. "What? I already cleaned our room," I replied. "You haven't cleaned my room or Olivia's room. And you haven't mowed the lawn either." "What? Why should I have to do that?" "What? Are you talking back to me? You should be grateful we're letting you stay in our house. I'm living here with Mark because we're worried about Richard. You asked us to move in. And now Olivia is siding with Diane? What's going on here?" "Sarah, are you arguing with my mom just because you don't want to do housework? That's ridiculous." "Huh? It just seems like you're being lazy and trying to avoid work." Frustrated, I snapped, "Fine. I'll clean everything, including Olivia's and Diane's rooms." I even mowed the lawn by myself, even though it was scorching hot outside. While I was doing all the chores they dumped on me, Diane and Olivia were playing with my daughter, Lily. I wanted to tell them to keep their filthy hands off my child. Of course, I told Mark everything when he got home from work. I asked him to speak up at dinner. Later, when we all sat down to eat, Olivia and Diane were still complaining about me. "What is this food? It tastes so plain. I don't like it at all." "I can't believe she's a housewife and still a bad cook," Diane added. Mark put down his fork and finally spoke. "Mom, Olivia, stop complaining about the food. Sarah made this for everyone." "Mark, are you seriously siding with your wife over this? Don't you have any pride as a husband? Do you actually think this food is good?" I love Sarah's cooking. It's really good," Mark stammered. I could see it. Olivia was controlling the situation. Mark wasn't standing up for me at all. I never thought he'd be this unreliable. That's strike 2. After that, Olivia and Diane's bullying didn't stop. It got worse. They made me do all the housework and errands, and if I refused, they complained. Diane even told me, "A wife belongs to this family. It's only natural that you do all the work. You should treat me like mom," Olivia added. "So do whatever I say." Basically, they were telling me to be their servant. At that point, I was sure Diane and Olivia were completely out of their minds. I started thinking about how to leave this house for good. Then, one day, I got a call from my mom. My dad had a stroke. Thankfully, it wasn't too serious, but he was in the hospital, so I packed my bags to visit him. That's when Diane walked into my room. "Sarah, what are you doing?" "I just got a call from my mom. My dad had a stroke and was taken to the hospital. I'm going to see him." Then Diane said something unbelievable. "Who said you could leave? This is your home. You have no other home." "What?" "Stop packing and get back to your chores." That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. If I stayed here any longer, I'd lose my mind. Ignoring Diane, I left. I went to the hospital and stayed with my mom for a few days, helping her around the house. Meanwhile, Diane and Olivia kept calling me and leaving nasty messages like, "What's wrong with you? You're Mark's wife. Stop running away and come home immediately." They were completely insane. I was already planning to leave Mark, but now I was furious with Diane and Olivia, so I decided to get revenge. Revenge takes time, so even though I didn't want to go back, I returned to Diane's house. As expected, she and Olivia kept treating me badly. Then, about 6 months later, during dinner, Olivia suddenly grinned and announced he proposed to me. She added, I'll bring him over for lunch next time. Finally, the time for my revenge had come. I was smiling to myself, thinking about my plan, but Olivia saw and mistook it. Oh, Sarah, you're happy for me too, she beamed. A week later, Olivia brought her fiancé over. His name was Jake. He worked for a big company, had a high salary, and seemed like a genuinely good guy. Honestly, he was way too good for Olivia. She proudly introduced him to everyone. Diane had no complaints and smiled, saying, You have my blessings. Please take care of Olivia. And that was my moment. It was time to get my revenge. I made tea for everyone and started chatting with Jake. So Jake, after you get married, will you be living with your parents? What? Oh no, I haven't really thought about that yet, Jake replied. But I heard in some families if your parents are over 60, you're expected to live with them. So I thought maybe you'd end up living with them or with us. No, there's no rule like that in my family, Jake said, looking confused. Ah, I see. Well, there are plenty of other rules in this house. For example, I was told that as a wife, you must obey your in-laws without question to show your gratitude. Also, you're not allowed to return to your own home because this house is now your home. When my father had a stroke, they tried to stop me from visiting him at the hospital, and instead wanted me to do all their chores. Jake's face started to frown. Is this true, Sarah? He asked Olivia. No, that can't be true. Olivia snapped. Sarah, you're just jealous of Jake and trying to stir things up. No, I said calmly. I'm just letting Jake know what it could be like if he marries into this family, giving him advice so he doesn't end up getting a divorce for no reason. With that, I pulled out a voice recorder and played the recordings of Olivia and Diane bullying me. Olivia and Diane's faces turned pale. After Jake finished listening to the recordings, he stood up and said, I'm sorry, but the wedding is off. Olivia, this is the last time we'll speak. With that, he left. Olivia and Diane were in shock and started crying. Watching them cry, I felt a huge sense of relief. Then, I packed my things and left the house with Lily. I left the divorce papers on the table for Mark. When he found them, he called me, but I couldn't hold back anymore. I told him off for being such an unreliable husband. A few days later, he told me he signed the divorce papers and sent them back. I was furious that he gave up so easily. He didn't even try to fight for me. But then again, he'd never been much of a man. Divorcing Mark was the best choice I could have made. According to a neighbor, both Mark and Olivia are still living at Diane's house like freeloaders. They don't help with any housework, so Diane's left doing everything by herself. On top of that, Olivia was so devastated by her broken engagement that she quit her job and now depends entirely on her father's pension. Mark spends all his money on his hobbies and doesn't contribute anything to the house. But it's none of my concern anymore. I do feel bad for Richard. He's stuck with such an awful, lazy family. As for me, I've been working hard again while my parents help raise Lily. She's growing up so fast and has been telling me all about the things happening in her kindergarten. Seeing her so happy makes me smile, and I'm going to keep working hard for her. Thanks for watching until the end. Please subscribe to our channel and hit the like button. See you in the next video.
I can't eat homemade food made by poor people like you. I prefer high-end sushi. Her words cut through the air, halting me in the middle of preparing dinner. Poor people, you said? I repeated, trying to make sense of her sharp, mocking tone. Her voice carried a hint of a smile, making her insult sting even more. I placed my hand on the kitchen counter, momentarily at a loss for words. Someone like you as a mother-in-law is the worst, she continued, her words dripping with disdain. But I'm trying to bear with it because your son is an elite, and your husband runs a company. Her casual cruelty hung heavy in the room, sucking the warmth from the atmosphere. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Years of hard work and dedication to keep this family together, dismissed with a single sentence. Yet, I held on, trying to believe there was more to her than the arrogance she displayed. Then, my husband, David, who had been silently observing, finally stood up. With just one word, he silenced the room, leaving us all frozen in place. My name is Lisa Scott. I live with my husband, David, and our 2 sons, James and Adam. I've spent most of my life as a stay-at-home mom, committed to raising my children. Perhaps my devotion to family stems from my own childhood, one marked by the absence of stability and love. When I was just 3, my parents divorced. My mother took me in, working tirelessly to provide for us. despite her efforts. We lived in poverty. Dinner was often the same meal night after night, and exhaustion etched itself into my mother's face. Yet, she never let her struggles overshadow her love for me. She celebrated my smallest victories and always found a way to make me feel cherished. But her health couldn't keep up with the endless sacrifices. When I started elementary school, she fell gravely ill, unable to work. She could no longer support us. The financial strain was too much, and I was sent to live in a children's home. Life at the home was challenging, filled with children from all walks of life. I learned independence, resilience, and the painful value of family. Those experiences shaped me, teaching me to treasure every moment with my loved ones. When I married David, we didn't have much, but we were happy. He started his business around the time I was pregnant with James. It was a slow start, but we made it work, always prioritizing family time. Over the years, his hard work paid off, the business flourished, and we were able to provide a comfortable life for our sons. James was ambitious and studious, earning a place at a prestigious university and later a job at a top company. Adam, our younger son, excelled in sports and earned a soccer scholarship. I still remember James's excitement when he shared his success. "Mom, Dad, I did it. I got in." My husband and I were so proud, knowing that his determination and hard work had paid off. As our sons thrived, I felt like our family had reached a beautiful harmony. That's why, when James introduced Mary to us, I wanted so badly to welcome her with open arms. Mary was tall, elegant, and carried herself with confidence. Her cheerful demeanor and engaging conversation instantly put me at ease. She spoke passionately about her career in interior design, and I found myself genuinely admiring her ambition. For a moment, I thought of her as the daughter I never had. She fit into our family so naturally, until I glimpsed a side of her I hadn't expected. When James stepped away to use the bathroom and David took a call, Mary's demeanor shifted, the warmth in her eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, critical gaze. Concerned, I asked, "Are you okay?" She blinked, her expression tightening. "What do you mean?" "It's just, your expression changed," I said cautiously. "Oh, it's nothing," she replied dismissively. Then, gesturing to the dessert I had served, she said, "Where did you get this cake? It tastes so cheap." I was taken aback. "Excuse me?" She smirked. "I have a favorite bakery. Next time, I'll bring something from there. You won't want to eat anything else after that." Her tone was laced with condescension as she poked at the cake with her fork. Her words lingered, leaving me unsettled. The cheerful, polite Mary from earlier seemed like a distant memory. I was surprised and a bit hurt by Mary's earlier words, but I decided to stay silent. When James returned from the bathroom and David finished his call, Mary's demeanor shifted as if nothing had happened. Her expression brightened, her cheerful tone returning effortlessly. I chose not to bring up the unsettling moment, but a sense of unease lingered. Later that evening, Adam arrived home. "I'm back," he called, sounding tired. "Welcome back, Adam. You're late. Everything okay?" I asked, watching him closely. "Yeah, just a long day," he replied, his tone weary as he walked into the living room. Mary stood up, her enthusiasm bubbling over. "Nice to meet you. I'm Mary. I've heard so much about you from James." Adam offered a polite but tired smile, extending his hand for a handshake. "Nice to meet you too," he said, his voice cordial but distant. We all sat down at the table again. James and Mary carried most of the conversation, while Adam remained quiet, only speaking when directly addressed. "You play soccer in college, right? What position?" Mary asked, trying to engage him. "Forward," Adam replied curtly. "That's so cool. Soccer must require a lot of teamwork." "Yeah, it does." Despite her efforts, Adam's responses stayed brief. Mary didn't seem bothered and moved the conversation back to herself. "I was in the volleyball club in college. Team unity is everything, don't you think?" "Yeah, I guess," Adam said, clearly uninterested. The atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Suddenly, Adam stood up. "Hey, where are you going?" James asked, sounding annoyed. "I'm tired. I need some sleep," Adam replied, irritation creeping into his voice. "That's rude. Mary's here, and you're just leaving?" Adam shrugged. "I don't think it's rude. Good night." As Adam walked out, Mary's warm expression flickered. She glared at his back and clicked her tongue, a subtle but telling gesture. My stomach tightened. Was there something more beneath her cheerful facade? Mary quickly regained her composure. "It's been a long day. I think I'll head home now," she said, her voice light again. After seeing James and Mary off, I turned to David. "What do you think of her?" She seems cheerful and nice, he said thoughtfully, but Adam's behavior was unusual. He's not usually like that. I noticed too, I said, my voice quieter. I don't want to jump to conclusions, but something feels off. David gave me a reassuring look. Let's give it some time. Everyone feels things differently. That night, the house was quiet. As I sat on the sofa reflecting on the evening, Adam walked in. Mom, can I talk to you? Of course, I said, gesturing for him to sit beside me. He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. That girl, Mary, I don't think she and I get along. James likes her a lot, but I just don't get a good feeling about her. Why do you feel that way? I asked gently. It's not anything specific, he admitted, just a feeling. I nodded slowly. I understand. Sometimes, gut feelings matter. He looked relieved. She smiles, but I feel like there's something else behind it. I felt it too, I confessed, not to speak ill of her, but there's something unsettling about her. I don't want to upset James, but I can't ignore it either. Our conversation lasted a while, with Adam expressing his unease. His concerns mirrored my own, and I felt more justified in my cautious approach. The next morning, tension hung over breakfast. When Mary's name came up, Adam's expression hardened. James, what do you even see in her? Stop it, Adam, James snapped. Why do I have to explain myself to you? Come on, it's weird. Mom feels it too. I don't care what Mom said, James shouted. I like Mary. Their argument escalated until I intervened. Enough, both of you. That's no way to talk to each other. Adam calmed down, though his face remained stormy. James stayed upset, but I tried to ease the tension. Adam, it's important to respect James's choice, but James, we can't dismiss how Adam feels either. Fine, Adam muttered, backing off. As breakfast ended, the mood lightened slightly, but Adam's worried expression stayed with me. Despite the tension, James and Mary eventually got married. For their first holiday as newlyweds, they planned to stay over, and I prepared a feast to celebrate. When they arrived, Mary's eyes lit up at the sight of the spread. Wow, this looks amazing. I've never seen such a feast before. Thank you, I said warmly. I made this to celebrate your marriage. Thank you so much. I feel so blessed, Mary said, smiling sweetly. Her words eased some of my doubts, and we began eating together. However, as we cleaned up after the meal, Mary's tone shifted again. These plates are a bit old, aren't they? She said, her voice laced with condescension. These plates have been with us since we got married. They're full of memories, I explained. Oh, I see, she said with a faint smirk. Or maybe you just can't afford new ones? Her words stung. Mary, before I could respond, she whispered coldly, you should serve sushi next time. I can't eat homemade food made by poor people like you. I froze, her words hitting harder than I expected. This wasn't the Mary James saw. This was someone else entirely. I was stunned by Mary's words and the cold stare she gave me. Poor people? Did you really say that? My voice rose before I could stop it, drawing the attention of James, Adam, and David. It's nothing, Mary said quickly, trying to brush it off. But I couldn't let it go. You called us poor, didn't you? She clicked her tongue, a look of disdain crossing her face. So, the mask slips, Adam said, glaring at her. Why did you even marry James? You're just after his and Dad's money, aren't you? Calm down, Adam, James said, stepping in. Don't be ridiculous. Mom's just imagining things. Imagining? Didn't you hear what she said to Mom? How can you defend her? Adam shot back, the tension between the brothers rising. I said it as a joke, Mary interjected with a dismissive wave. No need to make such a big deal out of it. A joke? I said, my voice steady but firm. Mary, even as a joke, that's not something you should say. Words like that hurt. Mary rolled her eyes. Fine, sorry if you're all so sensitive. Sensitive? Adam was furious now. This isn't about sensitivity, it's about respect. Do you even care about James or this family? Mary sighed dramatically, as though she were tired of the entire exchange. Of course, I care about James. Why else would I marry him? Adam wasn't convinced. Then why say things like that about his family? If you cared, you wouldn't be so disrespectful. I was just being honest, Mary said, her tone sharpening. James told me himself how hard your mom's life was growing up. I'm just stating the obvious. She's strong, sure, but having someone like her as a mother-in-law isn't exactly ideal. Her words cut deep, and I saw the shock on James's face. Mary, what are you saying? He asked, his voice trembling. I'm saying the truth, James. You're an elite. Your family isn't exactly on the same level, But I thought I could overlook that because of you, she said, her voice cold and unapologetic. And honestly, she added, glancing at Adam, he's more my type anyway. Adam's chair scraped loudly as he stood, his fists clenched. That's enough. The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging heavy. My husband, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up, his voice calm but commanding. Mary, I think it's time you left. What? Why? Mary looked genuinely surprised. I've tolerated a lot for the sake of peace, but insulting my family crosses a line, he said, pulling out his phone. I'm calling your father, he needs to know what's happened here. Wait, what? Mary stammered, but my husband didn't waver. Minutes later, the doorbell rang, and David went to answer it. Mary's parents entered the living room, her mother looking nervous while her father, Larry, appeared calm but firm. What's going on here? Larry asked, his gaze shifting between us and his daughter. Your daughter has crossed a line, my husband said. She insulted my family, and it's clear she has no respect for us. Mary? Larry turned to her, his tone heavy with disappointment. What did you say? I didn't do anything wrong, she protested. Don't lie to me, Mary, he said sternly. Tell me the truth. Mary hesitated but didn't respond. Her mother tried to defend her. Larry, let's not jump to conclusions. Enough, he cut her off. Mary, you've embarrassed this family. If you can't respect James's family, you have no place here. Dad, you can't mean that. Mary's voice cracked as the weight of his words hit her. I do, Larry said firmly. It's time for you to grow up. You'll learn the value of respect and family when you're on your own. Tears streamed down Mary's face, but Larry didn't relent. You're leaving with me today, and until you can apologize and prove you've changed, you're not welcome here. Mary and her parents left soon after, the atmosphere in the house heavy with unresolved tension. James sat quietly, his head in his hands. I'm sorry, he finally said. I should have seen this sooner. It's okay, I said, placing a hand on his shoulder. What matters is that we move forward. In the months that followed, James and Mary finalized their divorce. While it was a painful chapter, it brought our family closer together. James later met Erica, a kind and thoughtful woman who valued family above all else. Their relationship blossomed naturally, and when James introduced her to us, we instantly felt at ease. Years passed, and our family grew with new spouses, grandchildren, and shared memories. We learned that love and respect are the true foundations of family. Watching my grandchildren play in the yard one sunny afternoon, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. We had faced challenges, but through it all, our bond had only grown stronger.
Having me as a so-called useless daughter-in-law must be such a disappointment. At least that's how she always made me feel. Her mocking laughter rang through the phone, leaving me stunned. The arrogance in her voice and her blatant disregard for me ignited a surge of anger. She had always treated me like I was nothing, but this time, her cruelty went too far. As the rest area faded into the distance, I realized I was completely alone. Moments ago, I had been with my family, but now they had abandoned me. Confusion and fear swept over me, yet her cold, cutting words echoed in my mind. You who just sit around the house don't deserve to stay at a hotel. My chest tightened. Despite all my hard work, she never acknowledged my efforts. I ran an inn with dedication and managed every detail to perfection. Yet she clung to her narrative, intent on destroying my self-worth. On her end of the call, I could hear relatives laughing, their mockery amplifying my isolation. Her influence had turned the entire family against me. Even my husband refused to defend me. Anger and sadness churned inside me. The humiliation, the dismissal of my contributions, and now this outright betrayal. It was too much. Her sneering face and contemptuous eyes filled my mind. Her obsession with pushing me away felt suffocating. Something inside me snapped. A decision crystallized in my mind. No more. I drew a deep breath and held my phone tightly, my fingers trembling, not with fear, but with the raw power of long-suppressed rage. My heart raced, fueled by a newfound determination. "Hello," I said, dialing with shaky fingers. My voice was calm, steady, yet brimming with resolve. "I have a favor to ask." This was the beginning of reclaiming my life. It was also the first step toward an unexpected revenge. My name is Maya Smith, age 40. I'm a manager at a large corporation. I met my husband, Tom, in our late 30s. After dating for 6 months, we decided to marry. In the beginning, he was attentive and kind, but over time, he grew indifferent. Now, our conversations are minimal, and he barely notices my presence. Still, I accepted it, convincing myself this was just the way things were. One evening, as I cleaned up after dinner, Tom spoke to me unexpectedly. "Hey, Maya, I need to talk to you." "Oh, what's up?" I replied, smiling, pleased he was addressing me directly for once. "My family is planning a trip, about 20 relatives. They want me to handle the hotel reservations and organize the itinerary." "Really? That sounds like a big task." "Well, I'm busy with work, and you've got more days off than I do. So you take care of it. Find a cheap place, since I'm paying for everything. If you're coming, pitch in too." I wanted to point out that I worked hard and upheld my responsibilities just as much as he did, even if I had slightly more flexibility. But I bit my tongue. For once, he was asking for my help, and I wanted to oblige. Spending time with his family wasn't exactly enticing, but this was for him. "Okay," I said. "I'll handle everything." "Thanks. Just pick a place that won't embarrass us in front of my family." With that, he lay back on the couch, scrolling through his phone. After finishing the cleanup, I retreated to the bedroom and made a call to a familiar contact. "Hi, it's me. I need a favor," I said, my voice calm yet purposeful. A few days later, Tom's parents arrived at our apartment. When I had shared the travel plans with Tom, he'd insisted we invite them over to go through the details in person. As they stepped inside, Tom's mother, Elaine, made a beeline for my kitchen cabinets and began rummaging through them without hesitation. "Maya, are you seriously eating gourmet instant curry from a hotel? How indulgent. You should be cooking for Tom instead of living off things like this," she remarked with mock disapproval, pulling out a few packets. Without asking, she casually dropped them into her bag. This was nothing new. Every time Elaine visited, she treated my kitchen like her personal shopping aisle, helping herself to groceries, canned goods, and even decorative items. Once she took a set of dishes without a word. Her justification was always the same. "Anything in my son's house is fair game. What's wrong with me taking it?" After that, I started hiding my favorite items before their visits. Tom's father, Rick, stood idly by, laughing as Elaine continued her spree. Once she was done shopping, she finally sat down. Timing it perfectly, I presented the hotel details. "Here's where we'll be staying," I said, pulling up the website for the luxury hotel I had booked. I handed them my phone to show off the sleek images of the newly opened property. Elaine glanced at it, her lips curling into a dismissive scoff. "Well, aren't you getting above your station? How are you affording this?" Fortunately, I managed to negotiate a group discount under Tom's name. I replied evenly. "I thought you were useless, but I guess you can handle something like this," she said, her tone haughty. Her words stung, but I didn't let it show. What Elaine didn't know, and what I hadn't shared, was the truth about the hotel. It was part of my own business. My family had operated a modest inn for years, but after it gained media attention, bookings skyrocketed. With the surge in demand, especially from international tourists, we expanded into high-end hospitality. I had been managing the new luxury property ever since. Tom knew my family owned a business, but he had no idea I was running such a prestigious hotel. I had kept it a secret, fearing it would create tension. Tom had once complained about my income surpassing his, so I downplayed my career whenever it came up. Over time, I resolved not to share the full extent of my success with him or his parents. "I'm sure you'll love it," I said with a polite smile. "The place is beautiful and the hospitality is exceptional." Elaine gave me a skeptical look. "We'll see. I'll keep my expectations low." Then, without missing a beat, she added, "Since we're here, let's do some shopping. And we should grab dinner at a nice restaurant too." She completely ignored my offer to cook a meal and left shortly after. The day of the trip finally arrived. Tom, his parents, and I set off in his car, planning to meet the rest of the family at the hotel. Elaine, seated in the back, couldn't resist her usual jabs. "Tom, isn't it time you replaced this old car? You shouldn't be driving around in something so shabby." Tom sighed, keeping his eyes on the road. "I'd love to, but it's not in the budget." I glanced at him, feeling a pang of sympathy. This trip was already expensive, and I knew how much pressure he was under to impress his family. "Oh, I'll pay for it. I can't stand the idea of my son driving around in such a junker," Elaine said with a dramatic sigh from the backseat. "Really? Thanks, Mom," Tom replied, brightening immediately. "Of course. We'll go to the dealership together next week and pick out something more impressive. They continued chatting as if I weren't sitting right there beside Tom in the front seat. Moments like this had become the norm with his family, but that didn't make it hurt any less. You know, Elaine mused, her tone turning sharp. If only there were grandkids along for this trip. But I guess at this point, it's too late to hope for that. Well, that's what happens when you marry a woman who's already past her prime. Mom, Dad, can you not? Tom muttered, but he didn't press further, letting their cruel comments hang in the air. I kept quiet, staring out the window, regretting ever agreeing to come along. After a long silence, I finally spoke up softly. Tom, I need to use the restroom. Can we stop at the next service area? Elaine immediately rolled her eyes. Couldn't you have gone before we left? This is why we're always late. I'm sorry, I'll be quick, I assured her. Tom pulled into the next service area, and I hurried inside. The line for the women's restroom was long, and I nervously glanced at my watch, worried about holding everyone up. After 10 minutes, I finally emerged, only to find the parking space where Tom's car had been now empty. Confused, I looked around, wondering if I had somehow missed them. I called Tom, but he didn't answer. Slowly, the realization sank in. After a few more failed attempts to reach him, I tried Elaine instead. She answered immediately. Oh, hello, Maya. Something wrong? I'm still at the service area, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Did something happen? Oh, we're already at the hotel, she replied, her tone dripping with disdain. Trips like these are for family, you know. You're just an outsider tagging along. Her words hit like a punch to the gut. Elaine, you're already spoiled with what my son provides without working or contributing. You can sit this one out, she cut me off, her mocking laughter ringing through the line. In the background, I could hear other family members laughing too. Then, without waiting for a response, she hung up. I stood there stunned. The weight of her words settled over me as I fought against the despair creeping in. I had worked tirelessly to organize this trip, putting my own responsibilities on hold, only to be abandoned like this. But feeling sorry for myself wouldn't solve anything. I faced worse as a hotel manager, handling crises with composure. Drawing on that strength, I took a deep breath and called the hotel. Hello, this is Maya. I have a reservation under Smith. Could you confirm it, please? After ensuring everything was in order, I made another call. Hi, it's Maya, I said to my assistant at the main office. I'm stranded at a service area and need a ride to the hotel. Of course, Ms. Smith. I'll send a car right away, she replied. Relieved, I hung up. Soon, I'd be back on track. Meanwhile, in the car, Elaine gloated to Tom. That woman's never been a good fit for you. She's too old for kids and not exactly a catch. Mom, enough, Tom said, though his voice lacked conviction. I'm just saying, you deserve someone who's actually a family person, she continued. Tom sat in silence, torn but unable to find the courage to defend me. Later, at the hotel, Tom and his family settled into their luxurious rooms, enjoying the evening as if nothing had happened. They gathered in the dining area for an elaborate meal. Tom really went all out with this place, Rick said, looking around in approval. This hotel is famous nationwide. I hope it didn't cost too much. Well, Maya handled the arrangements, Tom admitted, trying to sound casual. I'm covering it, of course. That's what a good husband does. Tom's unease was evident, but he tried to push it aside and enjoy the moment. The next morning, as the family prepared to check out, they assumed all charges were already covered. But as they gathered in the lobby, the hotel manager approached them. Excuse me, here's your final bill, he said, handing Tom a detailed statement. Tom frowned as he glanced at the total. His eyes widened. The charges included a suite upgrade, additional services, and the group's special rate. Wait, Tom stammered. Why is this so much more than expected? I thought everything was handled with a discount. I apologize, sir, the manager said with polite firmness, but the discounted rate was only available if the owner was present. Tom frowned, his confusion evident. The owner? Who's that supposed to be? That would be Maya Smith, your wife. The room fell silent. Tom's face paled and a hush settled over the family. Elaine clutched her purse tightly, as though holding onto it could somehow make the charges vanish. You mean Maya, owns this hotel? Tom stammered, his voice shaky. The manager gave a calm nod. Yes, she's the owner. Since she wasn't present, The discounted rate is void. The total amount due now is $20,000. Elaine gasped, her grip on her purse tightening further. Tom, do something. This must be some kind of mistake. I didn't know, Tom stuttered, looking increasingly flustered. I didn't realize Maya was the owner. The manager extended the bill with a steady hand. How would you like to settle this? The other relatives began murmuring among themselves, shifting uncomfortably. You didn't know she owned this place, and she paid for everything. Someone whispered. Tom's gaze fell to the floor, unable to meet their eyes. Meanwhile, I arrived at the hotel, determined to face Tom and his family. The staff greeted me warmly. Welcome back, Miss Smith, the manager said with a respectful smile. Everything has been handled as you requested. I thanked him and headed to the lobby. As I entered, I spotted Tom and his family at the counter, their expressions a mix of embarrassment and unease. Squaring my shoulders, I approached them, my head held high. Good morning, everyone, I said, my voice calm but firm. I see you're having a lovely time. The shock on their faces was almost comical. Elaine was the first to recover, her tone thick with false sweetness. Maya, dear, we were just surprised. We didn't realize you were the owner here. I'm sure you didn't, I replied evenly, but I hope my outsider status no longer concerns you. Maya, listen, Tom began, but I held up a hand to stop him. No, you listen. You left me behind because I wasn't family enough. But I'm the reason you're even here, and I pay for everything. A heavy silence followed. No one dared to look at me, their eyes cast downward. Now about that bill, I added, my tone resolute. No more discounts. Consider it payment for the years of disrespect. Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked away, a sense of closure settling over me. I left them to figure out how to handle the costs on their own. Later that day, I decided to check out of my hotel suite and head home. The decision felt symbolic, leaving behind not just the trip, but Tom and his family, once and for all. Back in my suite, I packed my bags, reflecting on everything I had endured. This trip had been a turning point, a realization that I deserved respect and appreciation, things I'd never received from Tom or his family. As I was finishing up, the manager knocked on the door and entered carrying a parting gift. Miss Smith, thank you for your continued partnership and for trusting us. We hope this is just the beginning of many more successful ventures. Thank you, I replied, smiling. This hotel feels like a second home to me, and you've helped make it truly special. Checking out of the hotel felt like stepping into a new chapter. A powerful sense of freedom washed over me, freedom from the past, from constant judgment, and from the weight of others' expectations. In the days that followed, I filed for divorce, finally choosing myself over a loveless marriage. I poured my energy into expanding the family business, opening more luxury inns, and pursuing dreams I'd shelved for far too long. Surprisingly, news of my divorce and Tom's mounting financial troubles soon spread, but I didn't dwell on it. My new life was brimming with purpose, community, and growth, surrounded by people who respected me and believed in my vision. On quiet evenings, I'd raise a glass to myself, grateful for the strength to walk away and build a life on my own terms. Happiness, I realized, was something I could claim for myself, and I wasn't looking back.
Once a woman marries, she's no longer part of the family. Family celebrations are only for family, so leave already. My sister, Amy, said this to me with a sneer, while my mother stood by, telling me to hurry up and go. I had returned to celebrate Amy's coming-of-age ceremony, hoping for some warmth, but my family treated me as an outsider. At that moment, it became painfully clear I was no longer one of them. My chest tightened, but I quickly composed myself. If that's how they feel, there's only one thing I can do, make them regret their words. My name is Sherry, I'm 22 years old, and I've grown accustomed to living on my own. It's been 4 years since I left home after graduating from vocational high school. Life hasn't been easy, I've worked hard to make ends meet. It's not luxurious, but it's the life I chose, and I take pride in supporting myself. Yet, even now, memories from the past linger like shadows. My mother and Amy's actions still weigh on me. The day before my first birthday, my father left us for another woman. My mother never forgave him. Unfortunately, I inherited his features, and because of that, my mother harbored a deep resentment toward me. You're just like him. Seeing your face makes me sick. As a child, I didn't fully understand her words, but I felt the cold stares, the disdain. To her, I was nothing more than a living reminder of her pain. In the beginning, my grandparents showed me some care, but as my mother leaned on them more and more for financial support, even they began to pull away. By the time I turned 2, my mother had remarried. Soon after, Amy was born, and my mother's new family unit was complete. Without me, I was an outsider. One day, I watched my mother, stepfather, and Amy pack their suitcases. "Where are you going?" I asked. "On vacation," my mother replied curtly. "Can I come too?" "Of course not. We'll drop you off at daycare." Their laughter echoed as they left without me. I was always left behind, sent to a 24-hour daycare while they went on family trips. Each time, I'd watch them leave with smiles on their faces, my heart sinking deeper into loneliness. At home, my mother's rejection became impossible to ignore. I was isolated, invisible to my so-called family. Once, Amy innocently asked my mother, "Why doesn't Sherry get a birthday party?" For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe my mother cared, after all. "Celebrate her birthday?" My mother scoffed. "There's nothing to celebrate." Her words cut me to the core. From that day on, Amy's attitude shifted. She began to look down on me, mimicking our mother's disdain. During family celebrations, I was always sidelined. Amy had birthday cakes and parties, while I had nothing, not even a candle to blow out. When I entered high school, I faced yet another blow. My family refused to pay for my education. Attending vocational school and working to support myself felt like an escape. Being outside, earning my keep, was far better than staying in that house. But no matter how hard I tried, home was still the only place I had to return to. My mother never acknowledged my efforts. At 18, I made the hardest decision of my life. I left. I couldn't take it anymore. I craved freedom, a life where I wouldn't feel suffocated sharing space with my mother, stepfather, and Amy. When I finally left, they didn't show a shred of emotion. "Do whatever you want, you're not our problem anymore," my mother said coldly. Those words severed the last fragile bond one had with them. Life on my own wasn't easy. I worked tirelessly to survive, but for the first time, I felt free to live for myself. Yet, even now, at 22, I can't entirely escape their shadow. Memories of my mother and Amy linger, especially with Amy's coming-of-age ceremony approaching. My own ceremony had been non-existent, but I knew Amy's would be lavish, as everything always was for her. One day, I received an unexpected call from my mother. Hearing her voice for the first time in years made my chest tighten. "Amy's 21st birthday is next week. You're not coming, right?" she said bluntly. I was stunned. Why would she even think to call me? "I wasn't invited," I managed to reply. "Good. It'd be awkward if you showed up," she said, her words cutting through me like a knife. After the call ended, a weight settled over me. I whispered to myself, of course I wouldn't go, but the suffocating ache in my chest didn't go away. I thought I had moved on, that I'd severed all ties with them, but why did they still have this hold over me? I told myself I wouldn't let them control me anymore, but the past is a stubborn thing, it refuses to let go. Yet, amidst the pain, I felt a faint desire to confront it, to confront them. Especially Amy. Despite everything, I wanted to celebrate her milestone, so I bought a cake and a gift and decided to visit my family for the first time in years. Standing in front of the familiar door, my heart pounded. It had been so long, and I was terrified of what awaited me. When I rang the doorbell, Amy answered. Her voice was sharp and mocking. "Who's there?" "Amy, it's me," I said cautiously. "Stop joking. I brought a cake. Please, open the door." After a moment of silence, the door swung open. Without a word, Amy snatched the cake box from my hands and, to my shock, threw it back at me. The box hit the ground, the cake splattering across the floor. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I can't eat food from a stranger," she sneered. Stranger. The word struck me harder than I expected. Deep down, I had hoped that despite everything, she still saw me as her sister, but hearing her call me a stranger made something inside me break. As I stood frozen, my mother appeared, laughing alongside Amy. "What were you thinking, coming here?" she said, her voice dripping with scorn. "Did you come to ruin things?" Her words stung, and I felt a wave of regret wash over me. "Why is she even here?" My stepfather's voice called out from the living room. "She's not family anymore." My voice trembled as I asked, "Am I not family? Why?" My mother scoffed. "Of course you're not family. We're not even related." Amy laughed, her voice cruel. "Did you really think you were one of us?" Their words crushed me. I had always known I didn't belong, but but hearing it said so plainly tore me apart. "Clean up that mess before you leave," my mother barked, gesturing to the ruined cake. Numbly, I obeyed. As I cleaned, Amy and my mother laughed mockingly behind me. "She brought the cake and now she's cleaning it up herself," Amy said. Pathetic. Their laughter echoed in my ears, but I focused on finishing as quickly as possible. When I was done, I turned silently to leave. "Leaving already? Should have never come, huh?" Amy taunted. I didn't respond. As I stepped out the door, Amy called out one last time. "Don't come back, stranger." Her words echoed in my mind as the door slammed shut behind me, sealing the final chapter of our relationship. I realized I had been clinging to a false hope that something might change, that somehow they might see me differently, but I was wrong. I was nothing more than a stranger to them, and maybe I always had been. It was time to stop wasting my energy trying to find a place in their lives. I already had a place where I truly belonged. That place was with my husband, Don. I met Don through a mutual friend, and from the moment he came into my life, everything changed. I had never thought I would get married. I didn't believe I deserved a family of my own, but Don saw me for who I was, accepted me completely, and never judged my complicated family history. When I shared my painful memories with him, he simply listened. "You didn't get to choose your family," he said gently, "but none of that is your fault. The family we create together will be your true home." His words warmed my heart, and for the first time, I felt like I truly belonged somewhere. With Don, I learned what happiness was. Our life together became my anchor, irreplaceable and full of love. But I had never told my family about him. I didn't want to invite their negativity into our lives. Still, news of my marriage somehow reached them. 3 days after the incident with the cake, my mother called unexpectedly. "I heard you got married. Why didn't you tell us something so important?" Her tone was accusatory, but I remained calm. "I didn't think it was necessary to tell you," I replied. There was a long silence on the other end. "Fine, do whatever you want," she said at last. "You'll end up alone anyway." This time, her words didn't hurt me. I had expected them. Instead, I felt reassured, knowing how happy I was with my new life. I wasn't alone, I had Dawn, and together we were building a family rooted in love and mutual respect. Her bitter remark was meaningless. It couldn't change my happiness. That phone call marked the final break between us. Or so I thought. 3 days later, the doorbell rang unexpectedly. When I opened the door, I was stunned to see Amy standing there. How had she found my address? Still, I invited her in. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my guard immediately up. "I just wanted to see what kind of guy you married," she said with a playful tone that put me on edge. As soon as she entered the living room, her eyes locked on Don. "This is your husband? Not bad at all. How did someone like you snag him?" I clenched my fists, anger simmering, but I stayed silent. Don, however, remained composed. "I'm Sherry's husband. Please stop with the unnecessary remarks," he said calmly. Amy looked surprised by his directness, but quickly recovered. She stepped closer to Dawn, her smile turning sickly sweet. "Don't be so stiff. Let's have some fun. Sherry won't mind, will she?" I was shocked by her audacity, but Dawn didn't waver. "I'm not interested. My happiness is with my wife," he said firmly. "Please stop this behavior." A wave of gratitude washed over me for Dawn's unwavering loyalty. Amy shrugged, her smile fading into a cold smirk. "Whatever. I don't care about your happiness anyway," she said with a dismissive tone. Her feigned indifference made my next steps clear. "You don't need people like her in your life, Sherry," Dawn said softly after she left. "For your sake, and ours, it's best to cut ties." His words mirrored my own thoughts. Amy and the rest of my family had no place in the life I was building anymore. It was time to let go. That visit was a turning point. For years, I had been sending money to my family. I had paid for Amy's tuition and even helped with the mortgage on their home, all in the hope that they might someday accept me as part of the family. But after Amy's visit, I realized I owed them nothing. They had taken all I had to give and returned only scorn. Now, I chose to give my energy, my love, and my support to the family I was creating with Dawn, a family built on kindness, respect, and unconditional love. It was time to stop looking back and start living fully in the present. I decided it was time to stop the financial support. When I told Don, he gave me a warm smile and nodded. "That's the right choice, Sherry. You've done more than enough. Now it's time to focus on yourself." His words lifted a weight I hadn't realized I was still carrying. Cutting off the money felt like reclaiming my freedom. I filed the necessary paperwork and halted the payments. For the first time, I felt a deep sense of relief. But peace didn't last long. A month later, my routine was shattered by loud, angry banging on the door. When I opened it, my mother and Amy stood there, their faces twisted in fury. Why didn't the tuition payment go through? The landlord is threatening eviction, my mother spat, her tone accusatory. Their outrage didn't surprise me. I had been expecting this confrontation. Taking a deep breath, I responded calmly. I stopped the payments, because I'm no longer responsible for you. Their expressions shifted from anger to shock. What do you mean you stopped the payments? Amy demanded. I even sold the house to recover what I already paid, I added, my voice steady. What? My mother's voice rose. You sold the house? How could you? You made it clear I'm not part of your family, I said, meeting their glares head on, so I have no obligation to support you. But what about my tuition? Amy cried. I can't finish school without it. That's your responsibility now, not mine, I replied firmly. I won't fund a family that doesn't include me. You can't do this. After everything I've done for you, my mother began. Done for me? I interrupted, my voice rising for the first time. You mean the years of neglect and cruelty? I owe you nothing, my decision is final. They tried to argue, their anger quickly turning to desperation, but I stood firm. You'll regret this, Amy yelled as they left. You're the worst sister ever. But their words no longer held any power over me. For the first time, I felt truly free from their grasp. A week later, their harassment escalated. They showed up outside my home daily, shouting and causing scenes. They even contacted Dawn's parents in an attempt to shame me. While my in-laws were understanding, they grew concerned. They've crossed the line, Dawn said one evening. You need to take action before it gets worse. At first, I hesitated, but I knew he was right. I gathered evidence from our security cameras and filed a police report. Initially, the authorities treated it as a family dispute and were slow to act, but I persisted. Finally, after another disruptive incident, the police intervened. My mother and Amy were warned to stay away, but they ignored the warnings. Their behavior escalated until the police had no choice but to issue formal restraining orders. Even my neighbors, fed up with the constant commotion, supported my case. Some suggested I move to escape the chaos. Don agreed. Let's start fresh somewhere new, he said. I couldn't have agreed more. Quietly, we found a new home and relocated. Even after the move, my mother and Amy tried to track us down. They even showed up at Dawn's parents' house, but my father-in-law firmly shut them down. Sherry is part of our family now, he said. If you have issues, they're your responsibility, not hers. Amy tried pleading with my mother-in-law for help, but she was equally resolute. You made your bed, now lie in it. Eventually, their efforts failed, and they stopped trying. For the first time in years, I felt free. The harassment had drained me emotionally, but once it ended, life became peaceful again. Dawn and I settled into our new home and focused on building a future together. My in-laws treated me like their own daughter, offering me the warmth and acceptance I had always longed for. Sherry, your family, they told me one evening, whatever happens, we'll always be here for you. Their words gave me a sense of security I had never known. Meanwhile, my mother and stepfather's fragile relationship fell apart without my financial support. Eventually, they divorced, and my mother lived a quiet, isolated life. Amy, too, faced the consequences of her actions. A potential marriage fell through when her fiancé learned about her family background and past behavior. Left to fend for herself, Amy struggled to rebuild her life. Despite everything, I couldn't bring myself to pity them. Their actions had led them to this place. In contrast, my life with Dawn flourished. We grew closer with each shared experience, facing challenges and celebrating successes together. We've been through so much, but look at where we are now, Dawn said one evening as we relaxed in our cozy living room. He took my hand and looked into my eyes. Let's focus on our future. I want to make you as happy as you make me. His sincerity brought tears to my eyes. For the first time, I felt like I belonged somewhere, with someone who truly cared for me. The shadows of my past no longer loomed over me. Don and his family became the family I had always longed for. Their love and support healed wounds I once thought would never mend. Family isn't just about blood, Don's father had once told me. It's about the bonds you choose to nurture. Those words stayed with me. Looking back, I saw my struggles with my mother and Amy as a painful but necessary part of my journey. They had taught me resilience and the value of true family. As Dawn and I moved forward, I knew I had finally found my home, a place filled with love, stability, and a future worth cherishing. My name is Layla, a 28-year-old housewife. My husband, Tom, works for a company, and we recently welcomed our long-awaited child, a beautiful baby girl named Elena. Our little family of 3 feels complete. Elena is so adorable that I could spend hours just staring at her. She looks just like you did when you were little, Layla, my mom often says. Seeing Elena brings back so many memories for her. Today, I invited my parents over to meet Elena for the first time. Tom, have your parents met her yet? I asked during breakfast. Tom hesitated before replying. No, they haven't. My parents aren't fond of children. They only had me because of societal expectations, and they made it clear they didn't want more kids. They're not interested in meeting Elena either. When I told them about her, they said not to bring her until she's an adult. Can you believe that? I was stunned. That's hard to imagine. I've met your parents a few times, and they didn't seem like the type. Is it really possible to dislike children so much that they wouldn't want to see their own grandchild? I'll send them a picture, Tom said, sighing. Maybe it'll change their minds. I'll keep trying to convince them to meet her. True to his word, Tom sent his parents a photo of Elena, but their response was lukewarm at best. As the months passed, Tom's efforts to persuade them continued, with little success. It's been almost 10 months since Elena was born, I said one evening. Have your parents changed their minds? Tom shook his head sadly. No, they're still against meeting her. I've tried everything, but they won't reconsider. I feel like a terrible dad for not being able to bring my parents around. I took his hand in mine. Tom, you're not a bad dad. Elena and I see how hard you're trying, and we love you for it. Right, Elena? I smiled at our baby, who was peacefully napping in her crib. Thanks, Layla, he said, his voice soft. I'll keep trying. While I admired Tom's persistence, I was growing tired of trying to cheer him up. If his parents didn't want to meet Elena, I was ready to accept it and move on. But I didn't have the heart to say that out loud, knowing how much it mattered to him. And what if Elena asked one day why she never met her grandparents? How could I explain their indifference to her? As Elena's first birthday approached, something unexpected happened, a phone call from my in-laws. Layla, it's been a while, Tom's mother began. Yes, it has. How are you? I replied cautiously. We're well. How is the baby? She asked. Her sudden interest in Elena caught me off guard. She's doing great, I said. Layla, did we do something to upset you? She asked hesitantly. No, not at all, I replied, confused. Other than not wanting to meet your granddaughter, everything has been fine. Then why haven't you let us meet her? She asked, her voice breaking. If it's hard for you to come here, we can come to you, or we can meet somewhere neutral, like a restaurant. Please, just let us see her, even if it's only once. I was shocked. You're saying, you want to meet her? Of course we do, she said, her voice trembling. Your father and I have been waiting to meet our first grandchild. We'll do whatever it takes to make it happen. Please, Layla. Her words left me speechless. Hadn't Tom told me they didn't want to meet Elena? I explained what Tom had said to me, and my mother-in-law sounded equally surprised. Just then, my mom, who was helping with Elena, overheard the conversation and suggested I hand her the phone. Hello, this is Layla's mom. It's been a while, she said warmly. As the two mothers began talking, Elena started crying. I held her close, my mind spinning with questions. Why had Tom told me they didn't want to meet Elena? And how would this revelation change things for our family? As Elena began to cry, I stepped away to comfort her. When I returned, it seemed like the moms, my mother and mother-in-law, had reached some sort of agreement. They told me they had come up with a plan but insisted I keep it a secret from Tom until everything was carried out. A few days later, on Tom's day off, my parents came over for a small family get-together. Elena just keeps getting cuter, doesn't she? My mom said, smiling as Elena babbled away. She's getting so good at talking too, my dad added. She's so smart, I agreed, holding Elena on my lap. It's hard to believe Tom's parents don't want to meet such an adorable granddaughter. They never liked kids to begin with, my mom replied, but Tom has been working really hard to change their minds. Good for him. Ever since I discovered that Tom had been lying to both me and my parents, I'd started doubting everything he said. It was frustrating, to say the least, but today, it was all going to come to light. The atmosphere seemed cheerful, but I could feel the tension bubbling under the surface. Everyone was nervous, waiting for the big moment. What are we waiting for? Tom asked, oblivious to what was about to happen. Just then, the doorbell rang. I opened the door to see Tom's parents standing there. Mom, Dad, what are you doing here? Tom stammered, his face turning pale. we're here to meet our granddaughter. Of course, his mother said firmly. Hurry and bring her out. But first, we need to wash our hands. Where's the bathroom? Tom looked flustered, clearly caught off guard. For almost a year, he had been lying to everyone, and now his deceit was about to unravel. I decided to play along. When did they change their minds? I asked innocently. They seem really eager to meet her now. Well, yeah, Tom muttered, avoiding eye contact. I've been talking to them, and I finally convinced them to meet her. Nice try, Tom, his mother said sharply, but we know the truth. No matter what excuses you come up with, we're meeting our granddaughter today. After washing their hands, Tom's parents approached me with warm smiles. They were playing their part perfectly, pretending they didn't know the full extent of Tom's deception. I never said you couldn't meet her, I said, feigning confusion. What's going on? Why the sudden visit? What are you talking about? His father interjected. We've been wanting to meet her for so long, isn't that right? At that moment, my parents walked in with Elena, who had been in the other room. There she is, my mother-in-law exclaimed, her eyes lighting up. Oh my goodness, what an adorable angel. Is this really our granddaughter? Elena smiled, giggling as she reached for her grandparents. She's such a sweetheart, I said, handing her to them. I'm glad you finally got to meet her. Now we can all talk. Tom looked cornered. What's going on here? I asked, turning to him. Why did you lie to both sides to keep them from meeting Elena? You owe us all an explanation. It was then that Tom's true motives came to light. He had been worried about the inheritance. As an only child, he had assumed everything would go to him. But after Elena was born, he realized she would have rights to a share. In his desperation to secure it all for himself, he had concocted a plan to prevent his parents from forming a bond with Elena. You've been thinking about inheritance when your parents are still alive? I said, appalled. You kept them from their granddaughter for a year, because of money? That's beyond selfish, Tom stammered. No, it's not like that. I was just following advice from my boss. Enough, his mother interrupted. Thanks to your efforts, we're going straight to a lawyer to make sure everything goes to Elena. While you're at it, I added, don't forget another document you'll need to sign, the divorce papers. Tom froze. Layla, no. Please don't do this. I can't stay married to someone who lies to everyone around him. It's only a matter of time before you try to manipulate Elena too. I'm done. Mom, Dad, Tom pleaded, will you still see Elena if Layla divorces me? Of course, his mother said coldly. We're cutting ties with you, not our granddaughter. You've made your bed, Tom. As I gathered Elena and prepared to leave, Tom's parents reiterated their plans. We'll make sure our estate is handled properly, his father said. And don't worry, Layla. Elena will always have us in her corner. With that, I walked out, leaving behind the home I had shared with Tom. It was no longer a place of trust or love, just a reminder of the lies that had nearly torn our family apart. After deciding to leave Tom behind, I packed up my things and returned to my parents' house. You're welcome to come too, Mom and Dad, I told them. We're getting everything ready to celebrate Elena's birthday there. Tom, left alone, pleaded desperately, wait. Don't leave me here by myself, but his cries fell on deaf ears as we headed to my parents' place. Shortly after, I finalized the divorce and secured full custody of Elena, along with child support. Tom didn't take it well. Angry at his boss for planting selfish ideas in his head, he caused trouble at work, which eventually led to him losing his job. He struggled to manage housework and daily life, often turning to his parents for help. However, they completely ignored his pleas, fed up with his behavior. I've heard they're even planning to sell their home and move far away, ensuring Tom won't find them. Back at my parents' house, I'd been raising Elena with their unwavering support. I managed to land a full-time job, and life has been looking up. Today is Elena's second birthday, and we're throwing a party to celebrate this precious milestone. As friends and family gathered, I stood up to make a toast. Thank you all for coming to celebrate with us today. If I may, I'd like to propose a toast. Everyone raised their glasses. Cheers, Elena beamed and, in her tiny voice, joined in. Cheers, wait, one of my relatives said with a laugh. She's only 2, right? I've never seen a 2-year-old say something like that so confidently. Neither have I, added another. Elena loves saying cheers, my mom chimed in. She practiced with Layla yesterday and did great. Surrounded by love, Elena is growing into a bright, happy little girl, a true treasure to everyone around her. As I reflect on how far we've come, I feel nothing but gratitude for the love and support that surrounds us. The future feels full of possibilities, and I'm excited to see what's next in our journey. I arrived home, greeted by warmth and celebration. Welcome back. Jel will be bringing her fiancé soon, my mom said. Jel is getting married? I said, still processing the news. It doesn't feel real. That day, my sister Jel came home to announce her engagement. I also decided to visit my parents, eager to share my own exciting news. Jel's getting married, and now I'm going to be a mom too. So many happy events. I exclaimed. It's been such a whirlwind, Jel said. By the way, I heard you left your new job. Was something wrong? It's a long story, I admitted. I didn't want to worry you, and I thought everything was resolved once I married Peter. Jel's fiancé, Josh, entered the room. Hi, I'm Josh, Jel's fiancé, he introduced himself. Nice to meet you, I said, smiling. Oh, you're Josh? You're younger than I expected. Don't be so nervous, everything's going to be fine. Despite my reassurances, Josh seemed uneasy. When's the wedding? I asked. Well, we haven't set a date yet, Jel replied. We need to coordinate it with your due date, now that we know you're pregnant. Josh's face turned even paler. Oh, I didn't realize, he stammered. Congratulations. Something about Josh's nervous demeanor unsettled me. He reminded me of someone from my past, though I couldn't place it immediately. The wedding day. The day of Jel's wedding arrived, filled with joy for some and anxiety for me. As I got up to use the restroom, supporting my heavy belly, my phone rang. Hello? I answered. The voice on the other end sent chills down my spine. Have you forgotten the name of the man you betrayed? John hissed. You and your unborn child should just disappear, you con artist. Before I could respond, I felt a violent shove from behind. I barely managed to grab the handrail, avoiding a fall down the stairs. I spun around to see Jel's future mother-in-law glaring at me. You've trampled on Josh's feelings, and you won't get away with it, she shouted, lunging at me again. Stop. Peter, my husband, appeared and restrained her. As chaos erupted, John emerged from the shadows. So, you're still alive, he sneered. You think you can cover your tracks by marrying that thug and having his kid? I'll make sure neither of you survives. John picked up an ashtray and aimed it at me, but Peter swiftly disarmed him, pinning him to the ground. The wedding descended into turmoil. An emergency meeting was called, where John, his mother, Josh, and our families gathered in a tense room. I'm so sorry, Josh began, his voice trembling. But John slammed his fist on the table. Why are you apologizing? The one at fault here is her. He pointed at me, spouting delusional accusations. You promised to marry me, John ranted, but instead, you betrayed me and got pregnant by that thug. Peter calmly replied, enough. Your lies won't hold up. We have proof of your attempted murder. What proof? John scoffed. Jel stepped forward, holding a camera. Actually, we recorded everything. This footage shows your mother pushing Emma down the stairs. John and his mother went pale. We've already called the police, Peter added. Aftermath. John and his mother were arrested and later faced charges for attempted murder. Josh, who had been manipulated by his family for years, cut ties with them. He later visited us, tearfully apologizing for their actions. Meanwhile, Jel and I moved forward with our lives. I gave birth to a healthy baby girl, and Jel remained optimistic about her future. Though the ordeal left scars, our family grew stronger, united by love and resilience.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Chen. Growing up, my parents instilled in me the belief that true wealth comes from humility and smart work. While other kids dreamed of being doctors or lawyers, I was captivated by the stock market. By 12, I was devouring investment books and obsessively tracking market trends, much to my parents' bewilderment. Sweetie, maybe you should spend more time with your friends. My mom would suggest, eyeing me over stacks of financial reports. This is fun for me, Mom, I'd reply without looking up. Did you know Warren Buffett bought his first stock at 11? She'd chuckle, shaking her head. Just promise me you won't forget to live while you're planning your empire. That promise grew harder to keep as my hobby turned into a passion and eventually expertise. By 16, I was managing a modest portfolio with my savings and allowance. Winning a full scholarship to study finance at Harvard felt like destiny. At Harvard, I met Michael. He was studying business administration, charming, ambitious, and aiming to climb the corporate ladder. We met during finals week, both reaching for the same economics textbook. Ladies first, he said with a warm smile. I laughed. Thanks, I'm Jennifer. Michael. Maybe we could study together. What began as a shared study session blossomed into daily coffee dates, then a relationship. Unlike others I'd met, Michael admired my ambition. You're going to dominate the business world, he'd say, watching me dissect market trends. Any company would be lucky to have you. What he didn't know was that I wasn't planning to work for anyone else. My scholarship covered everything, so I funneled my earnings into investments. By graduation, my portfolio had grown exponentially. But I kept it quiet. I wanted success on my terms, not as the girl with the trust fund. Michael landed a prestigious job at Sterling Industries, a major tech firm in Boston, while I chose to work independently. When I declined several high-profile offers, Michael was skeptical. Are you sure? He asked. These are dream opportunities. I have my own plans, I replied with a smile. Trust me. A year later, we got married in a modest ceremony. Michael's mother, Patricia, was less than thrilled with my career choice. Investment consulting, she'd sneer. Is that even a real job? I smiled, recalling my parents' advice about staying humble. By then, my portfolio was worth over $50 million, strategically diversified and quietly making me one of Sterling's largest individual shareholders. Though no one, not even Michael, knew. Michael thrived at Sterling, rising through the ranks to work under James Wilson, the arrogant VP of operations. Wilson was infamous for his outdated views, especially about women. The problem with modern marriages, he'd say at company events, is women forgetting their place. Michael would laugh awkwardly, avoiding confrontation. It irritated me, but I let it slide until the annual executive party. Sterling was unveiling restructuring plans, and as a key shareholder, I had a vested interest in attending. Are you sure you want to come? Michael asked. These events can be dull for non-employees. I think it's time I took a closer look at your work, I replied, carefully applying my makeup. I chose a classic black dress, pearl earrings, and my grandmother's vintage watch, a talisman in every major decision I'd made. The hotel ballroom buzzed with chatter as we arrived. Crystal chandeliers glittered overhead, and the scent of champagne lingered in the air. Michael led me to James Wilson, who was holding court near the bar. Jennifer. Michael. James called, raising his glass. We were just discussing Sterling's exciting new direction. Cutting R&D for short-term profits, I asked, feigning innocence. Doesn't innovation drive sustainable growth? James's smile faltered. Ah, the little wife has opinions on business, does she? Laughter rippled through the group. Michael shifted uncomfortably. She likes to read the financial news, he said quickly. Honey, maybe we should grab some drinks. But James wasn't done. Sterling's biggest problem, he announced loudly, is too many voices from people who don't understand real business, like housewives who think reading the Wall Street Journal makes them experts. The crowd chuckled, but I noticed the CEO, Thomas Richards, watching with interest. My husband, once so proud of my intelligence, stared at his shoes. Before I could speak, a familiar voice interrupted. Actually, James, you might want to rethink that. Sarah Martinez, my private banker and confidant, stepped forward, her smile sharp. Should I explain, Jennifer, or would you like to? James's smug expression faltered. What's going on here? I straightened, feeling my grandmother's watch against my wrist. The time had come. Since you're so concerned about shareholder value, James, I said, my voice calm, perhaps we should discuss the report I'm presenting at Monday's board meeting, the one outlining why your restructuring plan will fail. James turned crimson. Board meeting. What are you talking about? CEO Richards stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. Jennifer Chen, JC Holdings. I knew the name sounded familiar. I smiled. Surprise. Strategic anonymity can be a powerful tool. What's going on? Michael whispered, his face pale and voice trembling. Sarah stepped forward, her tone cutting through the silence. Your wife, she announced to the room, owns 51% of Sterling Industries shares. And no, she doesn't spend her days shopping. The silence hung for a moment before chaos erupted. James Wilson's face turned a vivid red, cycling through shades I didn't know were possible. Michael looked as though he might faint. This is absurd, James sputtered. There must be some mistake. Sarah, ever composed, tapped on her tablet. I can show you the documentation if you'd like. I have all the records right here. CEO Richards stepped forward, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. That won't be necessary, Sarah. I've suspected as much for some time. The board has been impressed with Mrs. Chen's insights and recommendations for years. James turned to him, stunned. You knew. Of course, Richards replied smoothly. Why do you think your restructuring plan hasn't been approved? Mrs. Chen raised significant objections. Michael finally found his voice, though it wavered. Jennifer. How? When? I met his wide-eyed gaze. Perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more private, I suggested, glancing at the growing crowd of onlookers. My office is just upstairs, Richards offered. Shall we? The elevator ride was oppressively silent. Michael alternated between glancing at me and staring at the floor, while James seethed. Sarah, steady as ever, stood by my side, a quiet but unwavering presence. Richard's office was expansive, with panoramic views of the Boston skyline. As we took our seats, James immediately claimed the chair nearest Richard's desk, as if proximity could restore his authority. Well, Richards began, leaning back in his chair, this has been an eventful evening. Eventful? James exploded. This is outrageous. She can't possibly. She can and does. Sarah interrupted, laying documents on the desk. Jennifer Chen, through carefully managed investment vehicles, controls 51% of Sterling Industries. She's been building her position over the past 5 years. Michael's expression morphed from confusion to hurt. 5 years? But we've been married for 3. I started investing in Sterling before we met. I explained evenly. The company had potential but needed modernization. I saw an opportunity. Modernization? James sneered. Yes, James, I replied calmly. Modernization. Like fostering innovation instead of getting R&D. Like respecting your employees instead of perpetuating a toxic workplace. Richards leaned forward. Mrs. Chen's recommendations have been instrumental in shaping our strategy. Her analysis has consistently outperformed expectations. Michael's voice was barely audible. Why didn't you tell me? I held his gaze. Would it have made a difference? Would you have defended me against James's comments if you'd known I was Sterling's majority shareholder? He flinched, the answer clear without being spoken. This is preposterous, James barked, rising from his chair. I've dedicated 15 years to Sterling. You can't just turn it into a toxic environment where innovation and talent are stifled. I interrupted. James, your restructuring plan would destroy this company. The board won't be supporting it, Richards cut in. In fact, we need to discuss your future with Sterling. My future? James looked stricken. Yes, I said, standing to meet his glare. Your leadership is outdated, your strategies are short-sighted, and your conduct unacceptable. Sterling deserves better. You can't fire me, James shouted. You're just a majority shareholder, Sarah interjected coolly. And yes, she can. Michael remained frozen, his expression unreadable. You told me you were consulting, he murmured. You said it was small scale. I never lied, I said softly. I just didn't tell you everything. Would you have respected my decisions if I had? James erupted again, pointing at Michael. She's tearing us apart. Women like her. That's enough, Richard snapped, his tone sharp. James, you'll receive the details of your separation package tomorrow. Please leave. James stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Sarah excused herself, leaving me alone with Michael and Richards. Mrs. Chen, Richards began, will you be taking a more active role in the company? Yes, I replied firmly, starting with a comprehensive review of our culture and leadership. Michael finally spoke, his voice cracking. And what about us? I turned to him, my voice steady. That depends. Are you ready to see me as an equal, Or am I still just the little wife you asked to stay quiet at company events? I need time, he stammered, standing abruptly. This is all too much. He left, and I watched his retreating figure. Richards cleared his throat. Family and business rarely mix well. True, I said, exhaling deeply, but principles shouldn't be compromised. The days that followed were a whirlwind. James's firing made headlines, Sterling Industries, a shakeup at the top. The stock price dipped briefly before recovering as my vision for the company became public. Michael stayed with his parents, processing everything. His mother left a string of hostile voicemails, which I deleted without hesitation. My focus remained on transforming Sterling, revitalizing R&D, implementing work-life balance policies, and fostering innovation. A week later, Michael returned. He looked worn, his usual polish replaced by exhaustion. "Can we talk?" he asked hesitantly. I gestured to the chair across from my desk. He sat, then immediately stood again, pacing nervously. "I've been thinking about everything," he began. "About us, about work." "And?" I prompted. "I was wrong," he admitted, his voice low. "I let James and others disrespect you. I should have stood up for you. I was so focused on my career that I forgot what really matters." I watched him for a moment before replying. "Change doesn't come through words, Michael. It comes through actions. Are you ready to show me that you see me as your equal?" He nodded, determination flickering in his eyes. "Yes, I am." I waited silently, giving him space to continue. "But you weren't completely honest either," Michael added after a moment. "You kept such a huge part of your life hidden from me. How are we supposed to have a real marriage with secrets like that?" "You're right," I admitted, keeping my voice calm. "I should have trusted you with the truth. But Michael, ask yourself, why didn't I feel I could?" He sank into the chair, his hands running through his hair. "Because I showed you I couldn't be trusted. Every time I laughed at James's jokes, every time I told you to stay quiet. I proved I cared more about office politics than supporting my wife." The next few weeks tested everything: my marriage, my resolve, and my ability to steer Sterling Industries through massive change. James Wilson hadn't gone quietly. He hired a lawyer and threatened to sue for wrongful termination, and his allies within the company whispered behind my back. "She's tearing down our traditions," they muttered in the break room. "This is what happens when you let emotions run a business," others sneered. But facts don't lie. Within a month, employee satisfaction soared by 40%, and R&D, finally free from James's stifling grip, filed 12 patent applications. The stock price climbed steadily, proving that my changes were more than just radical. They were necessary. At home, Michael hovered in a strange limbo, sleeping in the guest room and walking on eggshells around me. His mother, Patricia, however, had no such hesitation. She stormed into our house one afternoon, her designer heels clicking like gunfire. "We need to talk," she announced, barely pausing before stepping into the living room. "By all means," I said dryly, closing the door behind her. "This power trip of yours has gone far enough," she declared, folding her arms. "You've made your point. Now step back and let the men handle business." I raised an eyebrow. "The men?" "You've humiliated Michael enough already," she snapped. "His colleagues don't know how to treat him anymore. Do you have any idea what this is doing to his career?" "Humiliating?" I repeated. "Like being laughed at during business functions? Like being dismissed as just a housewife?" "That's different." She waved a manicured hand dismissively. "That's just how business works. Men need to." "Need to what, Patricia?" "Undermine women to prop up their egos. Pretend competence doesn't exist if it comes from the wrong gender." "You tricked him," she burst out. "My son married you thinking you were a normal wife, and no. Now what?" Michael's voice cut through the tension, startling us both. "Michael." Patricia turned to him, her expression softening with relief. "Thank goodness you're here. We need to talk sense into her before she destroys everything." But Michael wasn't looking at her. His eyes were locked on me, filled with something I hadn't seen in weeks: understanding. "Mom," he said evenly, "you need to leave." "What?" "But." "Now," he said firmly. After she left, silence settled between us. Michael sank onto the couch, exhaustion etched into his face. "I heard everything," he said quietly, "and I finally realized I've been just like her, treating you like you needed to be managed, not supported. And I'm sorry. I sat down beside him, keeping a cautious distance. I didn't want to outshine you, Michael. I just wanted your respect as your wife, as a partner, as a person. You have it, he said softly. I know I don't deserve your trust right now, but I want to earn it. Not because of your money or your power, but because I love you. And I want to be the partner you deserve. My phone buzzed, breaking the moment. It was Sarah. Jennifer, she said when I answered, James has withdrawn his lawsuit. Word about Sterling's latest quarterly projections has spread. And they're impressive. Send me the details, I said with a smile. And Sarah, thank you for everything. When I hung up, Michael asked, good news. James is backing down. I confirmed. It seems success really is the best revenge. Michael nodded thoughtfully. What happens now? With Sterling and with us. Sterling will keep evolving, I replied. We're rolling out a new parental leave policy and launching a mentorship program for women in tech next month. And us? He asked, his voice hesitant. I took a deep breath. That depends. Are you ready for a marriage of equals? Really ready? I'd like to try, he said, a small smile tugging at his lips. Starting with moving out of the guest room, if you're okay with that. It's killing my back. I laughed, surprising myself. We'll need couples counseling, and you'll have to stand up to your mother. Done, he said, grinning. Though maybe we should have dinner with her next week. I'd love to see her face when you explain your women's leadership initiative. For the first time in weeks, I felt real hope for our future.
I'm going on a business trip. Don't you dare call me unless it's a real emergency, my husband yelled as he hastily packed for his weekend away. All I had done was mention that I'd only contact him in case of an emergency, but his irritation was palpable. He clicked his tongue in annoyance, his usual sign of disdain. Of course, I knew the truth. This wasn't a business trip at all. He was off on a weekend getaway with his mistress. If you keep bothering me with your nonsense, I'll claim emotional distress and sue you, he added, his threats as absurd as they were cruel. Over time, it had become clear that John had lost all sense of empathy. He ignored our sick daughter, prioritized his own selfish desires, and neglected his family entirely. I didn't dare stand up to him. I was just trying to protect myself and our children. On the day of his so-called business trip, fate intervened. I accidentally learned that John had been in a severe car accident. His earlier command echoed in my mind, don't contact me under any circumstances. A part of me felt conflicted, but his indifference had long taught me to prioritize my own peace of mind. Whatever happened to him was no longer my concern. Besides, I was holding on to a secret of my own, something he didn't know and never would. A wry smile crept onto my face as I turned off my phone, shutting out his chaos. My name is Mary. I'm 34 years old, a handmade artist working from home. Creating accessories and crafts has been my passion since childhood. I turned it into a hobby, then a side business after leaving my job to raise our two children, Ethan, an 8th grader, and Claire, a 6th grader. Once Claire started school, I had the chance to revive my craft, selling my creations online. John, my husband, is 2 years older than me. We first met in high school and reconnected at a reunion years later. He works in construction management, a field he entered inspired by his father's legacy. His father had spent decades at the same company, continuing even past retirement, and John idolized him for it. Unfortunately, that admiration translated into John putting his career above all else, including his family. John's parents, both in their 70s, were active and frequently dropped by unannounced. While they claimed to visit out of affection, I often found their presence intrusive. From the beginning, my relationship with them had been strained. They made tactless comments about my work, belittling my handmade crafts as not being real work. The worst, however, was their lack of respect for our daughter Claire's severe shellfish allergy. If she ingests even a trace, it could be life-threatening. Yet they dismissed her condition as a picky eating habit and even tried sneaking shellfish into her meals. It's all in her head, they would say. If you just expose her to it gradually, she'll outgrow it. Allergies are just overblown nonsense. I had to be constantly vigilant. Whenever they visited, I ensured they were never alone with Claire. But their behavior became so reckless that I begged John to intervene. Your parents are putting Claire in danger, I pleaded. Please ask them to stop coming over unannounced. They're just trying to help, he replied dismissively. They care about Claire. You're overreacting. Mary, stop worrying so much. John always sided with his parents, leaving me to shoulder the household responsibilities alone. He was exhausted from work, and I became his emotional punching bag. The only person who truly understood my plight was Ethan, though he didn't have allergies himself. He adored Claire and went out of his way to help, checking food labels and standing up to his grandparents. One day, after John left for work, I received a midday call. "Can you clean my parents' house today? Mom's at her exercise class, and they need it done before she gets back. The kids are at school, and you're at home doing nothing, so it's no big deal," he said casually. "I have work too, John," I reminded him. "Don't act high and mighty about your little hobby, just do it." He hung up without waiting for my response, once again dismissing my time and effort as inconsequential. Resigned, I went to his parents' house. As I entered, the phone rang. Assuming it was a sales call, I answered. To my surprise, it was someone from John's company. His father had left critical documents at home, and they needed them urgently. They'd been trying to reach John's mother, but there was no response. I grabbed the documents from the table and decided to deliver them to the office. Why do I always get dragged into these things? I thought, exhausted by the constant demands. Even though it was just a short drive, the weight of it felt overwhelming. When I arrived at the company, I was greeted by one of John's coworkers, the same person who had called earlier. I recognized him from our wedding and the occasional times I had picked John up from work events. "Thank you, Mrs. Brown," he said sincerely. I didn't want to risk offending Mr. Brown's pride by calling him directly, so I tried his parents' house instead. "I'm glad you were there to help." His words seemed genuine, and he asked me to keep the matter a secret from John's father. As I turned to leave, he said something that stopped me in my tracks. "By the way, how's your daughter doing?" John mentioned her allergy. He said he's been taking days off to care for her. I froze. My mind raced as I tried to process what he had just said. John hadn't taken a single day off for Claire. He had gone to work as usual. Thinking it was a misunderstanding, I pressed for details. It turned out John had been telling his coworkers that he was taking time off to care for our daughter. My head spun as I drove home, trying to make sense of it all. When I arrived, the kids were already asleep. Hoping to calm my nerves, I switched on the TV, but I couldn't focus. Late that night, John finally came home, his usual irritated demeanor in full force. "You didn't clean my parents' house today," he snapped. Mom called to complain. I had completely forgotten about returning to his parents' house after visiting his office. "I went to their house, but then I had to take something to your father's office," I explained. John's eyebrow twitched, and he scratched his head, a nervous habit of his. His reaction only made me more suspicious. "Who told you to go to the company?" he asked, his tone unusually sharp. I could see the worry in his eyes, but I decided to play dumb. "No one. I just dropped off the documents and left. I forgot about the cleaning after that." John sighed, his tension visibly easing. "Whatever. Just apologize to Mom tomorrow. I'm tired and going to bed." As he walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something. That night, as I lay awake, I pieced together the clues: the lie about taking time off, his constant absences, and his overreactions. It all pointed to one thing: John was cheating on me. And if he was using Claire's allergy as an excuse to cover for his infidelity, I couldn't forgive him. Claire had already endured so much: teasing at school, being excluded from social activities, and constantly having to explain her condition. Ethan and I worked hard to support her, both emotionally and physically. Meanwhile, John dismissed her struggles as trivial while exploiting them for his own selfish purposes. I was consumed with anger and frustration, unable to sleep that night. By morning, I had made a decision. I hired a private investigator to uncover the truth. It hurt to spend the money I had painstakingly earned from my online business, but I needed to know. Each day, I anxiously awaited the investigator's report. A few weeks later, the results confirmed my worst fears. John was cheating. He was skipping work 2 to 3 times a week to meet his mistress, driving her around, and even spending nights at hotels with her. She was young, likely in her 20s, with long black hair and a confident, sharp look. She was stunning, beautiful enough to catch anyone's eye. Seeing the photos still left me speechless. Despite everything, it hurt to see the life we had built together crumble, but instead of sadness, I felt anger and disgust. Determined to move forward, I gathered more evidence with the investigator and consulted a lawyer to prepare for divorce. I started learning about alimony, child support, and custody. My thoughts were no longer on the past I shared with John, but on the future I would build for myself and my children. A few days later, John came home late again. "I have to work this weekend," he said nonchalantly. "The next job site is far away, so I'm going there for a preliminary survey." I'll be back on Sunday. I knew it was another lie. His coworker had told me weeks ago that John's role had shifted to an office-based position. Overnight trips were no longer part of his job. He was likely planning another weekend getaway with his mistress. I see, I replied calmly, but if anything happens while you're away, I'll call you immediately. Claire's been under the weather, and with your parents going on a trip, we don't have anyone else to rely on. Don't call me for anything trivial, he snapped, his irritation evident. I'll be busy working. He stormed off to the bedroom, but his overreaction only fueled my suspicions. That night, I retrieved his credit card from its hiding spot, annoyed that he might be spending money on his mistress. Logging into the credit card company's website, I entered the password. John always used the same one. Logging into John's credit card account was surprisingly easy. As I scanned the charges, one stood out, a transaction at a luxury inn located in a secluded mountain area accessible only by car. My heart sank. I looked up the inn online, and it was exactly the kind of place John would try to pass off as a gift for his parents. But I knew better. His parents were vacationing at a seaside hotel, not a mountain retreat. John was clearly planning a getaway with his mistress, so eager to enjoy the trip that he had lashed out at me earlier to ensure nothing disrupted his plans. Disgusted by his behavior, I decided to take the next step toward freedom. I opened an apartment rental website and scheduled viewings for the weekend. By the time Saturday morning came, John was gone, leaving with an overnight bag and barely saying a word. Claire watched him leave from the breakfast table, and Ethan, still recovering from a cold, lounged on the couch. After tidying up, I got ready to leave. I'll be back later. Take care of each other, okay? I said. Where are you going, Mom? Claire asked. I'll tell you later, I replied, keeping my tone light. Ethan, keep an eye on Claire. Got it, he mumbled. I planned to tell them about the divorce after securing a new place for us. John's bond with the kids was weak at best. Ethan resented his father's dismissive attitude toward Claire's allergy, so I doubted they would be shocked by the news. With John's parents also out of town, it felt like the perfect opportunity to take action. I spent all of Saturday viewing apartments and, by evening, finally found one that met all my needs. It was too late to sign the contract, so I planned to return the next day. As I drove home, I wondered if John was enjoying his romantic getaway. The thought enraged me, but I reassured myself that I was making progress. The next morning, I left the kids at home again and went to finalize the apartment lease. The process went smoothly, and I signed the contract, paying the necessary fees. It felt like I'd been hemorrhaging money lately, on the investigator, the lawyer, and now this apartment, but I told myself it was an investment in a better future. Just as I was leaving the real estate office, my phone rang. It was Ethan. What's wrong, Ethan? I asked, hearing panic in his voice. Mom, it's Claire. She collapsed. We're on the way to the hospital in an ambulance. I could hear the wail of sirens in the background. My hands trembled as I clutched the phone. Ethan passed it to a paramedic, who explained that Claire was in anaphylactic shock. My mind reeled. How had this happened? I had been so careful with her meals, ensuring there were no allergens. Shaken, I rushed to my car. My hands were trembling so much that I struggled to start the engine. Realizing I needed help, I reluctantly called John. If he was checking out of the inn by now, he should have been reachable, but no matter how many times I tried, he didn't pick up. My frustration surged, but it also grounded me. Taking a deep breath, I drove straight to the hospital. When I arrived, Ethan was waiting outside the examination room. Is Claire okay? I asked, my voice quivering. The doctor approached, his expression calm. Mrs. Brown, your daughter is stable now. Her blood pressure dropped significantly, but we managed to stabilize her. She's resting peacefully. A wave of relief washed over me, and tears welled in my eyes. Thank you, I whispered, overcome by the close call. Your son acted quickly by calling for an ambulance, the doctor added. He's a remarkable young man. Ethan looked down, avoiding my gaze, but I couldn't have been prouder. As the doctor explained Claire's condition and the need for hospitalization, I left briefly to retrieve her insurance card. While sorting through the documents at home, I noticed John's card was still there. If he was on an overnight trip, shouldn't he have taken it? I didn't have time to dwell on it. After grabbing the card, I rushed back to the hospital, confirmed Claire's stable condition, and began the admission paperwork. As I filled out the forms, Ethan nudged my arm and pointed to the TV in the hospital lobby. Mom, look at that, he said. On the screen was breaking news about a single-car accident on a mountain road. The footage showed a vehicle that had crashed through a guardrail, its front mangled but the rear, where the license plate was visible, relatively intact. Ethan and I recognized the car immediately. It was John's. The report mentioned that the 2 passengers had been taken to the hospital with non-life-threatening injuries. My stomach turned at the confirmation that he had been with another woman. Ethan didn't say anything further, but I wondered if he had already guessed I was planning to divorce his father. The shame of letting things spiral to this point weighed on me. Just then, my phone rang again. It was John. I hesitated, remembering his dismissive words from earlier. Don't call me for anything trivial. Now, desperate and likely scared, he was the one blowing up my phone. The irony was unbearable. After letting the call ring out, I silenced the phone. This isn't trivial, but it's not my problem anymore, I thought. I finished the paperwork and took Ethan home, where John's parents were waiting outside despite the late hour. I was already exhausted from the ordeal with Clara. Dealing with John's parents was the last thing I wanted. I left Ethan in the car and approached them. Mary, where have you been? This is an emergency. We've been trying to reach you. John's mother snapped. I had my phone off. I replied curtly. John's been in a car accident. He needed surgery and will be in the hospital for 2 weeks. He called us when you didn't answer, she continued, her voice rising with accusation. Oh, is that so? I said, feigning indifference. That's all you have to say? How can you be so calm when your husband is in such a serious condition? Do you even care about him? Their words ignited a simmering anger that I had been holding back for far too long. This was it. I was done. Clara was rushed to the hospital today in an ambulance. I began, my voice trembling but steady with resolve. She had a severe allergic reaction, and her life was at risk. I know you've heard this before, so don't pretend you don't know what I'm talking about. I pulled the evidence from my bag, the rice crackers that had nearly cost Clara her life, and held them out. Their expressions changed immediately, a clear sign of guilt. They scratched their heads nervously, a habit they shared with John whenever they were caught off guard. Ethan told me you came to our house today, claiming you were bringing back souvenirs from your trip. He said you showed him the usual rice crackers that Clara eats, but after Ethan left, Clara had a severe reaction in the living room. I gestured to the crackers. These aren't the usual kind. They're a limited edition flavor containing shrimp, but the box doesn't indicate that. Did you give Clara the shrimp crackers and then hide the evidence? John's mother stammered. We thought it would be fine. It's just in her head. I cut her off. I spoke to a lawyer. Intentionally giving someone an allergen when you know they're allergic could be considered assault. That's ridiculous. We were just thinking of you when we bought them. Thinking of me? My voice rose. You knowingly bought something dangerous and nearly killed my daughter. I'll never forgive you for this. Their protests fell on deaf ears as I unleashed the anger I had bottled up for so long. We came to tell you about John's accident, not argue, John's father interrupted, desperate to change the subject. I don't care about his accident, I said coldly. He was on a trip with his mistress. I handed them the evidence I had gathered from the private investigator. Their stunned silence confirmed they had no defense. I'm filing for divorce and suing all of you for damages, I concluded. At that moment, a police car pulled up. I had asked Ethan to call the authorities on our way home. The officers approached John's parents, requesting them to come in for questioning regarding potential assault charges. 2 weeks later, I received a call from the hospital where John was staying. The staff informed me that John had been demanding I visit. Reluctantly, I went, knowing it was the last loose end to tie up. You useless wife, you've ignored all my calls, John barked the moment I entered his room. I didn't answer because you told me not to call you for anything trivial. I figured you were busy, I said with a mocking smile. You took my credit card and insurance card, didn't you? Go to the front desk and pay my bill. I didn't bring your card. Maybe ask your parents for help. They're in jail because of you. The absurdity of his complaints made me laugh. I've already consulted a lawyer. You'll be hearing from them soon. Oh, and Ethan and Clara fully support the divorce. John's protests were cut short by the arrival of his mistress, Jessica, confident and unapologetic. She announced, John, I'll pay everything, alimony, child support, the hospital bills, if you divorce her and marry me. John, greedy and desperate, agreed, but before the ink could dry on their twisted arrangement, Jessica revealed her true identity, the granddaughter of a powerful crime boss. John's face turned ashen as men in black suits entered the room. Jessica smiled sweetly. Welcome to the family business, John. A month later, my divorce was finalized. Jessica paid every penny of John's debts. True to her word, John, now bound to Jessica and her dangerous world, had lost everything. As for me, I found peace with my children. Clara recovered fully, and Ethan grew into a strong, supportive young man. My handmade business flourished, and I promised myself that one day, I'd take my children on a well-deserved vacation to celebrate the new life we had built together.
I watched through the one-way glass as my parents shifted uncomfortably in the leather chairs of the bank's executive conference room. Time had changed them. Father's hair now completely silver, mother's perfect posture slightly stooped. But their air of entitled superiority remained intact even as they prepared to beg for financial salvation. The Chen family's request for a $50 million emergency loan. Thomas, my CFO, reviewed the file in front of me. Their real estate empire is on the verge of collapse. Overextended, overleveraged, and severely impacted by the market downturn. I nodded, studying my parents' faces. They hadn't seen me in 20 years, not since the night they'd thrown me out for choosing love over their arranged marriage plans. My name is Victoria Chen, and 2 decades ago, I was the perfect daughter of one of San Francisco's wealthiest families. Then I fell in love with James Walker, a brilliant software engineer from a working-class background. My parents' response had been swift and absolute: marry their choice, wealthy real estate heir Andrew Kim, or be cut off completely. I chose James. They don't know you own Meridian Bank? Thomas asked quietly. No, I replied, remembering the day I'd walked away from my family's wealth and privilege. They probably assume I'm living in some middle-class suburb, married to my poor husband. The irony wasn't lost on me. James's software innovations had made us billionaires within 10 years of our marriage, while my parents continued building their real estate empire the old way, through connections, leverage, and family money. We quietly revolutionized financial technology. 5 years ago, we'd bought Meridian Bank as part of our expansion into financial services. Now, watching my parents await their fate in that conference room, I thought about all they'd missed. Our wedding, celebrated with friends who loved us for who we were, not what we owned. The birth of our children, now teenagers who'd never met their grandparents. Every success, every milestone, every moment of the life they deemed beneath them. Their financials are worse than they're admitting, Thomas continued, flipping through reports. Without this loan, they'll default on multiple properties within months. The Chen empire will collapse. I studied the papers in front of me. The numbers told a clear story. My parents had overextended, betting big on luxury developments just before the market turned. Their old methods of doing business, relying on personal relationships and social connections, hadn't adapted to changing times. Mrs. Walker. Thomas's voice pulled me from my thoughts. How would you like to proceed? Before I could answer, the conference room door opened and Robert Nash, our senior loan officer, entered to meet with my parents. I turned up the room's audio. Mr. and Mrs. Chen, Robert began formally. I've reviewed your loan application. Surely you know our reputation, my father interrupted, his voice carrying that familiar note of aristocratic assumption. The Chen family has been a pillar of San Francisco society for generations. Yes, sir, Robert replied smoothly. However, in today's market, reputation alone isn't sufficient security for a loan of this magnitude. My mother's back stiffened. We have collateral. Properties, assets. All heavily leveraged, Robert countered. Your debt-to-equity ratio is concerning and your recent projects have significantly underperformed projections. This is merely a temporary setback, my father insisted. The market will turn. When? Robert asked simply. Your nearest loan payment is due in 6 weeks. Without this financing, you'll default on at least 3 major properties. The silence that followed was heavy. I watched my parents exchange glances, decades of certainty in their own superiority crumbling in real time. Perhaps, Robert continued carefully, you have other resources. Family members who could assist. My mother's face tightened. Our only daughter is no longer part of the family. Ah, yes. Robert consulted his notes with practiced casualness. Victoria Chen, now Victoria Walker. Quite successful in technology and banking, I believe. Her company's market cap recently exceeded $20 billion. I had to admire Robert's technique as he let that information sink in. My parents' expressions shifted from dismissal to shock as they processed the reality of their disowned daughter's wealth. Victoria, my father's voice cracked slightly. That's impossible. She married that engineer. James Walker, Robert supplied. The founder of Walker Tech. Their financial software revolutionized banking infrastructure. Surely you've heard of them. My mother's hand trembled as she reached for her water glass. We haven't had contact. For 20 years, Robert finished, since you disowned her for marrying beneath her social class. Though given current circumstances, one might question whose choice proved more financially astute. I almost smiled at the subtle dig. Robert was playing his role perfectly, letting my parents face the full impact of their past decisions. The loan, my father tried to redirect, his voice less certain now. Surely our assets are insufficient, Robert stated flatly. Without additional security or a guarantor, I cannot recommend approval. The weight of those words settled over the room. 20 years of certainty in their own superiority, their own rightness, crashing down in a single meeting. What? My mother's voice was barely audible. What are our options? Robert closed his folder deliberately. You could approach your daughter. Her resources could easily secure this loan. Though given your history, no, my father's pride surfaced briefly. We cannot. Cannot what? Robert's voice sharpened slightly. Cannot admit you were wrong? Cannot acknowledge that the daughter you rejected for marrying beneath her station has achieved more wealth and success than you imagined possible? My parents sat in stunned silence. In their world, bankers didn't speak to them this way. But their world was crumbling, and with it, all the old certainties. I'll leave you to consider your options, Robert stood. Though I should mention, you're not the only one seeking financing for distressed properties in this market. These opportunities don't last long. After he left, I watched my parents sit in silence, 2 decades of choices and consequences hanging heavy between them. Victoria, my mother finally whispered. All this time. We should go, my father stood abruptly. There must be other banks, other options. There aren't, I said softly to the one-way glass. I've made sure of that. Thomas looked at me questioningly. Your instructions? I thought about the night I'd left, carrying a single suitcase, walking away from wealth and privilege toward an uncertain future with the man I loved. I thought about James's quiet confidence as we built something together, something real. And I thought about our children, raised to value character over class, innovation over inheritance. Let them stew for a few days, I decided. Let them face the reality of their situation. Then have Robert call them back for another meeting. And if they reach out to you directly? I smiled, remembering all the ignored letters over the years, the attempts to maintain their control through silence and rejection. They won't, I said certainly. Their pride won't let them. At least, not yet. As I watched them gather their things, my mother's hands shaking slightly as she picked up her designer handbag, my father's shoulders bent under the weight of impending failure, I felt no satisfaction, only a quiet certainty that sometimes life has a way of bringing things full circle. They walked out of the conference room, stepping into their waiting car, less luxurious than in years past, I noted, likely heading back to their mansion to regroup, to plan, to avoid facing the inevitable. But I knew what they did. Their options had already run out. Every major bank in the city was either owned by us or partnered with us. Every potential investor had been quietly warned away. The empire they built on social status and old money was about to collapse, leaving them with only one possible salvation, the daughter they'd rejected for daring to choose her own path. Thomas gathered the papers, pausing at the door. The next meeting? 3 days, I decided. Let's see how they handle the wait. As I stood to leave, I caught my reflection in the glass. Successful, confident, self-made. Everything they'd feared I'd never be without their guidance and control. Oh, and Thomas, I added, make sure Robert mentions that Meridian Bank recently came under new ownership. Let them start wondering exactly who they're dealing with. 3 days stretched into 5 as my parents explored every possible alternative to facing their situation. Through our extensive network, I tracked their increasingly desperate attempts to secure financing elsewhere. Each inquiry met with polite but firm rejections. They've started selling assets, Thomas reported, setting a folder on my desk. Their vacation home in Aspen, 3 luxury cars, your mother's jewelry collection. I picked up the folder, studying recent photos of my childhood home. The perfectly manicured gardens looked slightly overgrown now, the grand facade showing signs of deferred maintenance. And the company? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Share price is falling. Contractors are demanding upfront payments. 3 major projects are at risk of complete shutdown. The Chen family empire, built over 3 generations, was crumbling in real time. And still my parents resisted the obvious solution. Then came the call we'd been waiting for. They've requested another meeting, Robert announced, but with one condition. They want to meet the bank's owner. I closed my eyes briefly, 20 years of memories washing over me. Set it up, tomorrow, 10 a.m. That evening, I told James about the meeting. He listened quietly as he always did, his brilliant engineer's mind processing the implications. Are you sure about this? He asked finally. We could buy their properties through intermediaries, save their company without revealing yourself. I shook my head. No, they need to understand exactly how wrong they were. About you, about me, about everything they thought they knew about worth and value. He pulled me close, and I breathed in the familiar scent of the man they deemed unworthy of their daughter. Whatever you decide, he said softly, I'm with you, just like always. The next morning, I dressed carefully, not in the designer labels my mother had insisted were essential to our social status, but in a perfectly tailored suit that spoke of confidence rather than wealth, success on my own terms. I'd arrived early, watching through the one-way glass as my parents were escorted into the conference room. They looked tired, the strain of impending financial ruin evident in their postures. Mrs. Walker. Thomas appeared at my side. They're ready. I took a deep breath. Let's finish this. The moment I walked into the conference room, time seemed to stop. My mother's hand flew to her throat, her face draining of color. My father half rose from his chair, sinking back as recognition hit him fully. Victoria, my mother whispered. Hello, Mother. Father. I took my seat at the head of the table, noting how their eyes tracked my every movement. I believe you wanted to meet the owner of Meridian Bank. The silence that followed was deafening. 20 years of rejection, of pretending I didn't exist, shattered by the reality of their current situation. You, my father's voice cracked. You own the bank. Among other things, I kept my tone professional. Walker Tech, my husband's company, you remember James, the unsuitable engineer, has grown significantly since you last saw us. All this time, my mother's perfectly maintained facade cracked slightly. You've been successful? Yes, I opened their loan application. Unlike Chen Developments, which appears to be on the verge of collapse, my father's pride made one last attempt. We don't need. Yes, you do, I cut him off. You need $50 million immediately to avoid default. Another $100 million within 6 months to stabilize your projects. Without it, 3 generations of the Chen family legacy disappears. They sat in stunned silence as I laid out their situation with brutal precision. How? My mother's voice trembled. How did you build all this? I gestured to our surroundings. Without your connections, your social circle, your arranged marriages, by understanding that true worth isn't about who you know or where you come from. It's about innovation, adaptation, seeing the future instead of clinging to the past. Victoria, my father leaned forward. Whatever happened, we're still family. Are we? I met his gaze steadily. 20 years ago, family meant controlling who I could love. It meant choosing status over happiness. It meant turning your back on your only daughter because she saw value in something beyond your narrow definition of worth. We were trying to protect you, my mother whispered. No, I corrected quietly. You were trying to control me. There's a difference. I pulled out another folder, photos of my life they'd missed. My wedding to James, the birth of our children, holidays, celebrations, moments of joy shared with people who loved us for who we were, not what we owned. Your grandchildren, I said, watching their faces as they stared at images of teenagers they'd never met. Emma's starting college next year, MIT, early admission. Michael's already developing his own software. They've never known their grandparents, never understood why their mother's family chose pride over love. Tears rolled down my mother's face as she touched the photos. My father's hands trembled slightly. The loan application, I continued professionally. I'll be direct. No other bank will help you. We made sure of that. Your only option is Meridian Bank, is me. What? My father swallowed hard. What are your terms? I placed a document on the table. Full disclosure of all assets and liabilities. Complete restructuring of management. You'll step down. Professional executives will be appointed. And I pause, letting the moment stretch. And, my mother prompted, And you'll both attend Sunday dinner at my house. Every week, you'll get to know your grandchildren, not as heirs to a fortune but as the remarkable people they are. You'll see the life you rejected, understand the happiness you dismissed as beneath you. They stared at me, decades of pride warring with desperation. If we refuse, my father asked quietly. Then Chen Developments fails, your empire collapses, and you spend your retirement wondering if your social status was worth the family you lost. The silence that followed was heavy with 20 years of choices and consequences. When? My mother's voice wavered. When is dinner? Sunday at 6, I stood gathering my papers. Don't be late. Emma's making her grandmother's dumplings. The ones you taught me before status became more important than family. As I walked to the door, my father called out, Victoria, we were wrong. I turned back, seeing for the first time not the powerful parents who'd shaped my childhood, but two elderly people facing the consequences of their choices. Yes, I said softly. You were. The question is, are you ready to make it right? The following Sunday, at exactly 6 o'clock, a car pulled up to our house. Not their usual luxury vehicle, but a modest sedan. I watched through the window as my parents approached the door, clutching a bottle of wine and looking more uncertain than I'd ever seen them. Emma opened the door, the granddaughter they'd never met welcoming them with her father's warm smile and her mother's strength. You must be my grandparents, she said simply. Come in. Dinner's almost ready. As they stepped into the home I'd built with the man they'd rejected, I saw them take in the success their narrow vision hadn't been able to imagine, not in designer labels or imported furniture, but in the patents framed on the walls, the prototypes of James's innovations, the awards for contributions to technology and finance. Welcome, James stepped forward, the unsuitable engineer now a respected innovator. We've been waiting a long time for this. And as we sat down to dinner, 3 generations at one table for the first time, I watched my parents begin to understand what they'd really lost 20 years ago. Not status or social position, but the chance to be part of something genuine, something built on love and innovation rather than privilege and pride. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. That would take time, effort, and genuine change on their part. But it was a beginning. A chance to rebuild not just their company, but something far more valuable. A family connection based on who we were, not what we owned. The Chen Empire might have crumbled, but from its ruins, something more authentic could grow. If they were willing to learn, to change, to see value beyond their old definitions of worth. As Emma served her dumplings, perfect replicas of her grandmother's recipe, learned from my memories rather than direct teaching, I saw tears in my mother's eyes. Perhaps she was finally understanding that true legacy isn't about money or status. It's about the connections we build, the love we share, and the courage to choose what's real over what's expected. The future would be different from anything they'd imagined, but maybe, just maybe, it would be better than the life they tried to force me into all those years ago. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't about making others suffer, it's about showing them exactly what they lost by being unable to see beyond their own prejudices. And as we ate together, this broken family taking its first steps toward healing, I realized that success truly is the best revenge, not because it proves others wrong, but because it proves you right for believing in yourself when no one else would.
I had always thought life would be smooth after getting married. I grew up in a loving but modest home, and despite the loss of my parents in my late teens, I carried their values with me: kindness, humility, and strength. My husband, Ethan, had swept me off my feet during our college years. He was charming, ambitious, and seemingly the perfect partner. At first, his family seemed welcoming enough. His mother, Eleanor, would flash a polite smile, though it never quite reached her eyes. His father, Gerald, was a man of few words, but his disapproving glances often lingered a little too long. Still, I chose to see the best in them because I loved Ethan. We moved into the large family estate soon after our wedding, as per Eleanor's insistence. She claimed it was only temporary until we could save for our own home. It seemed generous at first, but little did I know, I was walking into a gilded cage. Things started subtly, almost imperceptibly. I began to notice how Eleanor would frequently compare me to their family friends' daughters-in-law, who were doctors, lawyers, or heirs to substantial fortunes. You know, Olivia managed to host a charity gala for 300 guests all by herself, Eleanor once said, her tone dripping with feigned admiration. Isn't that impressive, Ethan? I smiled, feeling the sting but brushing it off. That does sound impressive, I replied. She's a natural, Eleanor continued, her gaze cutting into me. Not everyone has the upbringing for it. Ethan didn't defend me, he didn't even notice. It was easier to let these comments slide than to start a conflict. At least, that's what I told myself. Soon, Eleanor began treating me less like a family member and more like staff. She'd leave lists of tasks for me to complete during the day, ironing their clothes, polishing the silverware, and preparing dinner. Initially, I tried to comply, thinking it was a way to earn her approval, but no matter how hard I worked, it was never enough. One evening, after spending hours preparing a 3-course meal for the family, Eleanor frowned as she tasted the soup. "It's too salty," she declared, pushing the bowl aside. "Do it again tomorrow, and please, follow the recipe this time." Ethan said nothing, he didn't even meet my eyes. Ethan's long hours at work left me alone in a house that didn't feel like home. I tried to focus on hobbies, even attempted to make friends in the area, but Eleanor discouraged me. "Your place is here," she said one day when I mentioned wanting to join a local art class. "There's plenty to keep you busy at home." I realized then that she didn't see me as her son's wife, an equal partner in life. She saw me as an inconvenience, a mistake Ethan had made by marrying beneath their station. But I still held on to hope. I loved Ethan, and I believed he loved me. Surely, he would see how his family was treating me and put a stop to it, wouldn't he? The turning point came during a family dinner. Gerald invited one of his business associates, a powerful and wealthy man named Mr. Hawkins. As we prepared for the evening, Eleanor's instructions became relentless. "Make sure the linens are pressed perfectly," she snapped, "and don't embarrass us in front of Mr. Hawkins. He values class, and you're still learning." Her words stung, but I nodded and set the table with care. When Mr. Hawkins arrived, I was introduced briefly, before being relegated to the kitchen. I overheard snippets of their conversation as I served hors d'oeuvres. "She's very lucky to be part of this family," Gerald was saying. "Ethan is too kind. He could have married anyone, but he has such a big heart." The implication was clear. I was a charity case. My face burned with humiliation, but I kept my composure. The night dragged on, and by the end, I was left cleaning up alone. Ethan didn't even offer to help. I finally broke down in the dimly lit kitchen, tears streaming down my face as I scrubbed dishes, wondering how my life had come to this. I didn't know it then, but that dinner would set in motion a series of events that would change everything. The aftermath of the dinner left me emotionally drained. My days were starting to blur together, each one a copy of the last: cleaning, cooking, and being invisible in a house that should have been my sanctuary. But something about that night lingered in the back of my mind, an invisible weight pressing down on me. A week after the dinner, Eleanor summoned me to the living room. She was seated on the ornate couch, a cup of tea in her hand. Gerald stood near the fireplace, his arms crossed, wearing his usual look of quiet disdain. "We'll be hosting Mr. Hawkins again," Eleanor announced. "It's important that we make a good impression this time. Gerald has been working on a significant deal with him, and we can't afford to let anything go wrong." I swallowed hard. "Of course, what do you need from me?" "Everything to be perfect," she replied, her voice cool. "And this time, try not to look so plain. Presentation matters." I felt my cheeks flush with embarrassment, but nodded. As I walked away, I couldn't help but feel the weight of their expectations. I wasn't just a wife in their eyes, I was a pawn in their endless pursuit of social status. The day of the dinner arrived, and I worked tirelessly from dawn. The house gleamed, the table was set with the finest china, and the aroma of roasted lamb filled the air. By the time the guests arrived, I was exhausted, but Eleanor insisted I be presentable. As Mr. Hawkins stepped through the door, his presence seemed to command the room. He was tall, impeccably dressed, and carried an air of authority. His sharp eyes scanned the room until they landed on me. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something flicker across his face, a mix of recognition and shock, but just as quickly, it was gone. Dinner began, and I quietly served the courses, avoiding eye contact with anyone. As I placed a dish in front of Mr. Hawkins, he looked up and said, "Thank you, miss. Have we met before?" The question caught me off guard. I stammered, I don't think so." He tilted his head slightly, as though trying to place me. "You look familiar." Eleanor intervened, her tone sharp. "She's Ethan's wife. She tends to stay out of the spotlight." Mr. Hawkins didn't respond but gave me a small, polite nod. The rest of the meal passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me, studying me. The next morning, while cleaning up the dining room, I heard a knock at the front door. expecting it to be a delivery. I opened it without much thought. To my surprise, it was Mr. Hawkins. "Good morning," he said, his tone polite but firm. "May I speak with you?" I hesitated. Of course, should I get Gerald? "No," he said, shaking his head. "I came to see you." He stepped inside, and I led him to the sitting room, my mind racing. What could he possibly want? As he sat down, he studied me carefully. "I was up all night thinking," he began. "I couldn't shake the feeling that I've seen you before." I frowned, unsure where this was going. "I don't think we've met." "Perhaps not directly," he said, pulling out his phone. "But does this look familiar?" He showed me a photograph. My breath caught in my throat. It was of my parents. They were younger, smiling brightly at what looked like a formal event, and standing next to them was a younger version of Mr. Hawkins. How do you have this?" I whispered. "I was close friends with your parents many years ago," he said, his voice softening. "Your father and I worked together, and your mother was like a sister to me. When I saw you last night, I couldn't believe my eyes. You're their daughter, aren't you?" Tears welled up in my eyes as I nodded. "Yes, but they passed away years ago." He leaned back, his expression a mix of sorrow and relief. "I had no idea. They spoke of you often, how proud they were of you. I lost touch with them after they moved, and I always regretted it." For the first time in years, I felt seen. Mr. Hawkins' words were like a lifeline, pulling me out of the darkness I had been drowning in. He asked about my life, and I hesitated to share too much, but something about his genuine concern made me open up. "I'm glad I found you," he said finally. "Your parents were extraordinary people, and I owe them so much. If there's ever anything you need, don't hesitate to ask." I nodded, still overwhelmed by the revelation. As he left, he gave me one last look and said, "You deserve better than this." Those words echoed in my mind long after he was gone. In the days following Mr. Hawkins' visit, I couldn't stop thinking about our conversation. His words lingered in my mind, offering a faint sense of hope. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt like I wasn't entirely alone in this world. My parents' memory, through him, became a thread connecting me to something greater, a sense of belonging that I had lost. Eleanor, however, wasn't blind to the change in me. While I continued my duties, something about my demeanor must have shifted. One morning, as I was scrubbing the kitchen counters, she approached me with her usual air of superiority. "You've been awfully quiet lately," she said, her eyes narrowing. "Not that you're one for conversation, but you seem distracted." I shook my head quickly. "I've just been tired." She studied me for a moment before nodding. "Well, keep your focus. We're hosting another dinner next week. Gerald's promotion depends on securing Mr. Hawkins' partnership." My heart sank. Another dinner? The idea of being paraded around like a servant again made me nauseous. But then I remembered Mr. Hawkins' parting words, "You deserve better than this." A few days before the scheduled dinner, I found an envelope addressed to me on the hall table. It wasn't the type of thing Eleanor or Gerald would bother with. They never acknowledged my personal life. Curious, I opened it and was stunned to find a handwritten letter from Mr. Hawkins. "Dear Ava, it was truly a shock to see you again, but also a blessing. Your parents were dear to me, and I can't bear the thought of their daughter being treated unfairly. I have arranged for an opportunity that I believe could change your circumstances. If you're willing, come to my office this Friday at noon. I'll explain everything. Warm regards, Daniel Hawkins." My hands trembled as I read the letter. Could this really be happening? Was this the lifeline I had been praying for? Friday arrived, and I could barely contain my nerves. I told Eleanor I had errands to run and left the house, clutching the letter like a talisman. As I entered Mr. Hawkins' office building, my heart raced. The receptionist guided me to his office, where he greeted me with a warm smile. "I'm glad you came," he said, gesturing for me to sit. He explained that he had connections in a nearby nonprofit organization that supported women in difficult situations. He believed they could help me build a new life, one where I could rediscover my sense of self-worth and independence. "But there's more," he said, leaning forward. "Your parents left behind a trust fund in your name. I helped them set it up years ago, but I lost track of it when they passed. It's modest, but it's enough to give you a fresh start." Tears streamed down my face as I listened. The idea of starting over felt like a distant dream finally within reach. That evening, I returned home with renewed resolve. I knew Eleanor and Gerald would never let me go easily. They thrived on control. But now, I had something they didn't know about, a plan, a future, and the means to escape. I began quietly packing a few belongings, hiding them in the attic. Each day, I worked discreetly to gather what I would need. The upcoming dinner felt like the perfect cover. While their attention was focused on impressing Mr. Hawkins, I could slip away unnoticed. As the dinner approached, I found myself smiling more often, even humming as I worked. Eleanor noticed, but misinterpreted it as compliance. "Good," she said with a rare nod of approval. "You're finally understanding your place." If only she knew. The evening of the dinner arrived, bringing with it a storm of nerves and anticipation. Eleanor was in full command mode, barking orders at everyone to ensure perfection. Gerald, for his part, was too busy rehearsing his business pitch to Mr. Hawkins to notice anything out of the ordinary. I moved about the house methodically, my heart racing with each passing moment. Tonight would be my last night here. Guests began arriving, including Mr. Hawkins, who greeted me with a knowing smile. His presence was a reminder of the escape plan I'd meticulously crafted. The atmosphere in the dining room buzzed with polite chatter and the clinking of glasses. As expected, Eleanor had instructed me to stay in the kitchen, serving dishes and refilling drinks. But Mr. Hawkins wasn't content to let me stay in the shadows. "Ava," he called out when I entered with a platter of appetizers, "why don't you join us? After all, we've got much to talk about." Eleanor's face turned a shade of red I had never seen before. "Oh, there's no need for that," she said hastily, laughing nervously. "She's here to help, not to dine." But Mr. Hawkins wasn't deterred. "I insist," he said, his tone polite but firm. "Ava is like family to me. I won't have her treated otherwise." The room fell silent. Gerald shifted uncomfortably in his chair, while Eleanor sputtered for a response. Reluctantly, they allowed me to sit. I could feel Eleanor's eyes burning into me, but I kept my composure, buoyed by Mr. Hawkins' support. As the meal progressed, the conversation turned to my parents. Mr. Hawkins shared stories about them, how my father had been his closest friend and how my mother's kindness had touched everyone she met. For the first time in years, I felt like they weren't just a distant memory, they were alive in the room, in the words of someone who had truly known them. It was then that Mr. Hawkins dropped the bombshell. "Ava," he said, addressing me directly, "have you told them about the trust fund your parents left for you?" My heart stopped. I glanced at Eleanor and Gerald, whose expressions twisted from confusion to shock. "Trust fund?" Gerald repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. "Yes," Mr. Hawkins continued, turning his gaze to them. "Her parents left her a considerable amount to ensure she'd never have to rely on anyone else. I'm appalled to see how that generosity has been ignored." Eleanor stammered, trying to regain control. We weren't aware. She never mentioned it." I met her gaze for the first time that evening, my voice steady. "Because you never asked." The tension in the room was palpable. Gerald tried to defuse it, laughing nervously. "Well, this is a misunderstanding. Of course, Ava will have access to her funds. Isn't that right, Eleanor?" But Eleanor's veneer cracked. "She's ungrateful. After everything we've done for her, giving her a roof, food, this is how she repays us?" Mr. Hawkins interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "If by roof and food, you mean exploitation and mistreatment, then yes, Eleanor, this is how she repays you, by reclaiming her life." For the first time, I saw Eleanor rendered speechless. Gerald, too, slumped in his chair, his bluster evaporating. After dinner, I quietly gathered the bag I had packed and headed for the door. Mr. Hawkins followed, offering me a ride to the apartment he had arranged for me through his nonprofit connections. As I left, I felt a mixture of emotions: relief, empowerment, and a bittersweet sense of closure. Eleanor and Gerald didn't even try to stop me. They must have realized their grip on me was broken. The next morning, I woke up in a small but cozy apartment, my apartment. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. I started attending workshops at the nonprofit, where I learned skills to rebuild my life. Mr. Hawkins continued to be a mentor, guiding me through the process of managing the trust fund and pursuing my dreams. Most importantly, I began to find myself again. I wasn't just someone's servant or charity case. I was Ava, a woman with a future. Months later, I sat in a small cafe, sipping coffee and reading a book. My life wasn't perfect, but it was mine. The weight of the past had lifted, replaced by a sense of possibility. I thought of my parents often, not with sadness, but with gratitude. They had given me the strength to endure, and now I was finally living the life they had wanted for me. As for Eleanor and Gerald, I heard through the grapevine that Gerald didn't get his promotion. It seemed karma had its own way of balancing the scales. But I wasn't focused on them anymore. My life was ahead of me, and I was ready to embrace it. I never imagined my life would change so drastically. Growing up, my parents had been my rock, my constant support. We weren't wealthy, but we were happy. When I lost them in a tragic car accident just 2 years after my marriage to Liam, my world fell apart. Their absence left a void that I thought could never be filled. At first, Liam was supportive, holding me as I cried myself to sleep night after night, but things began to shift subtly, like a shadow creeping in at the edges of my life. Liam came from a well-off family. His parents, Harold and Marjorie, were influential, wealthy, and, most of all, cold. They had never approved of me. Marjorie once told me at a family gathering, "You're lucky my son sees something in you. Don't forget where you come from." I brushed it off then, thinking it was just her way of asserting dominance. But after my parents' death, her words seemed to echo in every interaction we had. Initially, I moved in with Liam's family temporarily while we searched for a new place. What started as temporary, though, turned into something far more sinister. Marjorie's disdain turned into outright hostility. She assigned me chores around the house as if I were the live-in maid. "If you're staying under this roof, you'll need to pull your weight," she'd say with a saccharine smile that barely masked her contempt. At first, I complied without complaint. After all, I was grieving and didn't want to cause trouble. But soon, it became clear that this wasn't just about helping out. Harold and Marjorie treated me as if I were beneath them. They'd host lavish dinners, inviting their high society friends, while I was relegated to serving drinks and cleaning up afterward. Once, during one of these events, Marjorie's voice cut through the room like a whip. "Sarah, dear, you missed a spot," she sneered, pointing to a speck of dust on the mantel. The guests laughed, and my cheeks burned with humiliation. Liam, standing nearby, said nothing. I tried to talk to Liam about it that night. "Your parents treat me like I'm their servant," I said, my voice trembling. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "They're just old-fashioned. Sarah, don't take it personally. It's their house, after all." "Old-fashioned?" I repeated incredulously. "Liam, they're demeaning me, can't you see that?" "Just let it go," he said, turning away. That was the beginning of the wedge that started to grow between us. One evening, Marjorie's friend, Evelyn, came over for tea. I was in the kitchen, preparing a tray, when I overheard their conversation. "Honestly, Marjorie," Evelyn said, "why does she even stay here? You'd think she'd have some pride." Marjorie's laugh was icy. "She has nowhere else to go. Poor thing, she's just lucky we're so charitable." The words cut through me like shards of glass. I wanted to march into the room and confront them, but I knew it would only make things worse. Instead, I stayed in the kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter until my knuckles turned white. As the months passed, their treatment grew worse. Harold would make snide comments about how people like me didn't understand the value of hard work, despite the fact that I had been juggling 2 jobs to help Liam through college before we got married. Marjorie, meanwhile, seemed to delight in finding new ways to humiliate me. Once, during a family dinner, she asked, "Sarah, do you even know which fork to use?" The table erupted in laughter, and I felt like sinking into the floor. But the breaking point came one fateful evening. Harold announced that his boss, Mr. Grant, would be coming over for dinner. "This is an important night," he said, looking pointedly at me. "Try not to embarrass us, Sarah." That night, as I set the table with trembling hands, I resolved to endure whatever insults came my way. For Liam's sake, I told myself, but deep down, a part of me wondered how much longer I could take it. Little did I know, that evening would change everything. As the months wore on, my situation with Thomas's family continued to worsen. Despite my best efforts to blend into their world and earn their respect, nothing I did seemed good enough. Each day blurred into the next, with tasks piling up and the disdain from my in-laws becoming more overt. I found myself waking up before sunrise to prepare breakfast for the entire family. By the time I sat down to eat, Thomas's mother, Elaine, would click her tongue disapprovingly. "This toast is overdone," she'd complain. Or, "Didn't I tell you I prefer my eggs sunny side up?" It didn't matter how much effort I put in, she always found a flaw. Thomas's father, Richard, wasn't much better. He often treated me like invisible help. If Elaine had guests over, Richard would bark at me to refill glasses or serve hors d'oeuvres, all while ignoring my existence otherwise. I felt like a stranger in the home I had once thought of as my refuge. Thomas, once my biggest supporter, now seemed indifferent to my struggles. When I tried to talk to him, he would brush me off. "They're just set in their ways," he'd say. "You've got to learn to pick your battles, Mia." But how could I pick my battles when I felt like I was fighting a war on all fronts? My breaking point came one evening when Elaine invited some of her friends over for a dinner party. She spent the entire day barking orders at me, making sure the house was spotless and the menu impeccable. I was exhausted by the time the guests arrived, but I put on a polite smile and carried out the tasks she assigned me. Toward the end of the evening, one of Elaine's friends asked about my family. I hesitated for a moment, then explained that I had lost my parents at a young age and had grown up in foster care. The room fell silent, and I immediately regretted sharing. Elaine broke the awkward tension with a forced laugh. "Well, that explains why you're so good at handling things on your own," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. Her friends chuckled politely, but I could see the judgment in their eyes. For the rest of the evening, I felt like I was on display, a curiosity for these well-heeled women to dissect. Later that night, I confronted Thomas in our room. "Your mother humiliated me tonight," I said, my voice trembling. Thomas barely looked up from his phone. "You're overreacting, Mia. She didn't mean anything by it." "How can you say that? You heard her." He sighed heavily, as if I were the one inconveniencing him. "You need to stop making everything about you. My parents have done so much for us." I stared at him in disbelief. "So that gives them the right to treat me like I'm beneath them?" Thomas didn't answer, and I realized that the man I had married, the man who had once promised to stand by me no matter what, was no longer the same. The next day, while running errands for Elaine, I stopped at a small cafe to grab a coffee. As I waited in line, I overheard a conversation at the table behind me. A man in a sharp suit was speaking animatedly about a new charity project he was spearheading. His voice was warm and inviting, and for a moment, I felt a pang of longing. When I turned to glance at him, our eyes met. He smiled, and I quickly looked away, embarrassed. Little did I know, that chance encounter would change the trajectory of my life. That evening, Elaine announced with great fanfare that Richard's boss, Mr. Harrington, would be joining us for dinner the following week. She was in a flurry of excitement, directing preparations like a military general. "This is a big opportunity for your father-in-law," she said. "Don't screw it up, Mia." I wanted to roll my eyes, but I bit my tongue. I knew this dinner would be another test, and I braced myself for whatever was to come. The days leading up to the dinner were grueling. I spent hours cleaning every corner of the house, polishing silverware, and perfecting recipes under Elaine's watchful eye. By the time the evening arrived, I was too tired to even feel nervous. As the guests began to arrive, I tried to stay in the background, serving drinks and making myself as inconspicuous as possible. But when Mr. Harrington walked through the door, my heart stopped. It was the same man I had seen at the cafe. He paused when he saw me, his brow furrowing slightly. "Mia?" Everyone turned to look at me. I froze, unsure of how to respond. "You two know each other?" Richard asked, his tone laced with suspicion. Mr. Harrington's face broke into a smile. "Oh, we go way back, don't we, Mia?" The room buzzed with curiosity, and I could feel Elaine's eyes burning into me. I had no idea how to explain this twist of fate, but one thing was clear: everything was about to change. The moment hung heavy in the air as everyone waited for me to respond. My mind raced, trying to process Mr. Harrington's words. "We did go way back, but not in the way anyone in this room might imagine." "Why, yes," I stammered. "Mr. Harrington knew my parents." Richard's eyes narrowed, clearly suspicious. Elaine, ever the perfectionist host, tried to diffuse the tension with a forced laugh. "Well, what a small world. Please, come in, Mr. Harrington." As dinner progressed, the conversation seemed to center around Mr. Harrington. As everyone fawned over his stories of success, I quietly served dishes, keeping my head down and avoiding his gaze, but every so often, I'd catch him watching me with a curious expression. Finally, as the evening began to wind down, Mr. Harrington asked to speak with me privately. Elaine looked displeased, but she didn't dare argue with someone of his status. We stepped into the hallway, and he turned to me with an incredulous expression. "Mia, is it really you? I can't believe this. How have you been?" Hearing the genuine concern in his voice brought tears to my eyes. "It's been difficult," I admitted. He nodded, his brow furrowing. "After your parents passed, I lost touch with you. I tried to find out where you'd gone, but I ended up in the foster system," I said quietly. His face fell. "I'm so sorry, Mia. Your parents were dear friends of mine. They would be heartbroken to know what you've been through." I didn't know what to say. The flood of memories from my childhood, coupled with the overwhelming kindness in his voice, made me feel a mixture of relief and sorrow. Mr. Harrington's concern didn't end there. As he prepared to leave, he asked Richard and Elaine if I could see him to his car. They reluctantly agreed, clearly eager to maintain their connection to such an influential figure. As we walked down the driveway, he turned to me and said, "Mia, you don't belong here. They treat you like you're nothing, but I can see that you've grown into a strong, capable woman. Your parents would be proud of you." Tears welled up in my eyes again. No one had spoken to me like this in years. "I don't have anywhere else to go," I said, my voice trembling. He placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. "You have me now. I'll help you get back on your feet, I promise." Over the next few days, Mr. Harrington's words stayed with me. For the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope. I began to imagine a life beyond the walls of Thomas's family home, a life where I could reclaim my sense of self-worth. But breaking free wasn't going to be easy. I knew that Elaine and Richard would never let me go without a fight. They saw me as nothing more than a convenient housekeeper, someone who could be easily controlled. That's when Mr. Harrington reached out to me with a plan. One afternoon, while Elaine and Richard were out, I received a call from Mr. Harrington. He told me about a job opening at his company, one that he believed I'd be perfect for. "I know it's a lot to process," he said, "but I want you to think about it. This could be your chance to start fresh." I hesitated. The idea of working for someone as accomplished as Mr. Harrington was both exciting and intimidating, but more than that, I feared how Thomas and his family would react if they found out. "You deserve this, Mia," he added. "Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." That evening, as I tried to muster the courage to tell Thomas about the opportunity, a confrontation erupted. Elaine stormed into the kitchen, furious that I had forgotten to polish the silverware for an upcoming party. "You can't even do the simplest tasks right," she snapped. Before I could respond, Thomas chimed in, "Mom's right, Mia. You've been slipping up a lot lately." His words felt like a slap in the face. After everything I had endured, this was how they saw me? Something inside me snapped. I thought of Mr. Harrington's offer, of his belief in me, and of the life I could have if I was brave enough to take a step forward. I looked Thomas in the eye and said, "I'm done." His brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" "I'm done being treated like a servant. I'm done living in a house where I'm not respected. I'm leaving." The room fell silent. Elaine and Richard stared at me in shock, and for once, Thomas had no words. That night, I packed my things and left. As I walked out the door, I felt a mixture of fear and exhilaration. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing: I wasn't going to let anyone hold me back anymore. I stood on the sidewalk outside Thomas's family home, clutching my small bag of belongings. The house loomed behind me, cold and unwelcoming, but as I took my first steps away, I felt the weight begin to lift from my shoulders. That night, I stayed at a small motel. Using the little savings I had managed to squirrel away, I replayed the events of the day in my mind, wondering if I had made the right decision. Doubts crept in, but then I thought of Mr. Harrington's words. "You don't belong there, Mia. You're capable of so much more." I resolved to believe in him and in myself. The next morning, I called Mr. Harrington to let him know I had left. He was relieved and immediately arranged for me to meet him at his office downtown. Walking into his sleek corporate building, I felt out of place. Everyone was dressed sharply, moving with purpose, and I couldn't help but feel self-conscious in my worn-out clothes. But when Mr. Harrington greeted me with a warm smile, some of my nervousness melted away. "I'm so glad you came," he said, ushering me into his office. "I've been thinking about how we can get you started on the right foot." He explained the job he had in mind for me, an entry-level administrative role. It wasn't glamorous, but it was an opportunity to learn, grow, and, most importantly, to earn my independence. "You've got potential, Mia," he said. "I see it. This is just the beginning." Starting at the company was daunting. I had little experience, and the learning curve was steep. There were moments when I doubted myself, times when I felt overwhelmed by the demands of the job, but every time I wanted to give up, I thought of where I had come from and where I wanted to go. Mr. Harrington became a mentor to me, offering guidance and encouragement whenever I needed it. Slowly but surely, I began to find my footing. I made friends among my colleagues, who were supportive and kind. For the first time in years, I felt like I belonged. As I settled into my new life, I began to confront the pain of my past. Losing my parents had left a hole in my heart, and the years of mistreatment had made me doubt my worth. But through therapy and self-reflection, I started to heal. One evening, I found myself sorting through a box of my parents' old belongings that Mr. Harrington had kept for me. Among the photos and keepsakes was a letter my mother had written to me years ago. It read, "Mia, life will have its challenges, but never forget how strong and capable you are. You have a kind heart, and that will take you far. Always believe in yourself, even when it feels impossible." Reading her words brought tears to my eyes. I realized that, despite everything, I was living the life my parents would have wanted for me, a life of dignity, hope, and possibility. Several months later, I ran into Thomas at a coffee shop. He looked surprised to see me, and, to my astonishment, a little ashamed. "Mia," he said awkwardly, "I've been meaning to reach out." I crossed my arms, unsure of what to say. "Listen, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't treat you right. None of us did. I'm sorry." His apology was unexpected, and while part of me wanted to lash out, I chose a different path. "Thank you," I said simply. "I hope you've learned from it." Walking away from him, I felt a sense of closure. I no longer needed validation from Thomas or his family. I had found my own strength. 1 year after leaving Thomas's family, I had built a life I was proud of. I had been promoted at work, moved into a cozy apartment, and even started taking classes to further my education. Mr. Harrington remained a guiding presence in my life, and I was grateful for his kindness, but more than that, I was proud of myself, for taking the leap, for persevering, and for rediscovering my worth. As I sat on my balcony one evening, watching the sunset, I thought about my journey. Life hadn't been easy, but it had taught me resilience. I whispered into the fading light, "Thank you, Mom and Dad. I'm finally living the life you always wanted for me," and for the first time in years, I felt truly at peace. My name is Abigail, and I am 25 years old. Yesterday marked a significant milestone in my life. I married my partner of 4 years in an intimate backyard ceremony, perfectly timed to coincide with our 4th anniversary. Though the wedding was small, its importance made postponement unthinkable. Every detail, from decorations to catering, had been carefully arranged, underscoring how impractical it would have been to reschedule. Yet, the day was bittersweet. My father, who was meant to walk me down the aisle, was absent. Initially, he claimed a medical emergency, but under pressure, he confessed the truth. He had chosen to attend a rare camping trip with my brother, who only visits a few weeks each year. His decision felt like a prioritization of my brother over me, and his dismissive suggestion that rescheduling would be easy only deepened my hurt. In his absence, my stepdad walked me down the aisle. It was a touching moment, but it carried a weight of emotion that shouldn't have been there. When my father arrived after the ceremony, he was visibly moved by the photos. Realizing the magnitude of what he had missed, we had a raw, emotional conversation that culminated in his tearful request for a second ceremony as a way to make amends. The situation left me conflicted. While I was deeply hurt by his initial decision, I was also pained by the regret and guilt he felt afterward. The day, which should have been filled solely with joy, became a reflection of the complicated dynamics within my family, underscoring how seemingly simple choices can have profound consequences. Growing up, my relationship with my family was always complex, particularly with my older brother. Despite my efforts to feel genuinely happy for him, his arrogance often overshadowed my admiration. Gifted in many areas, he had a way of positioning himself as the center of attention, which only amplified his brash demeanor. He didn't hesitate to tease or bully me, making our relationship tense. When he left for college, I felt an undeniable sense of relief. This dynamic was further strained when my parents divorced during my middle school years. Their marriage had been fraught with tension for as long as I could remember, and while they put on a united front in public, their unhappiness at home was palpable. Their split was triggered by my mother's affair with a college friend, which led to a bitter and contentious divorce. Despite the circumstances, my father agreed to shared custody. The aftermath of the divorce was challenging. My father began drinking more heavily, and his relationship with me grew increasingly distant, especially after I chose to maintain a friendly relationship with my mother and her new husband. My brother, on the other hand, sided completely with my father, often vocalizing his disdain for my mother and stepdad. This created a deep rift between us, as I sought to navigate a middle ground. A few months after the divorce, my mother remarried. I stood as a bridesmaid at her wedding, but my brother refused to attend. Despite his resentment, he was still required to spend half of each month with our mother, per the custody agreement, a situation he bitterly opposed. Unlike my father, my mother treated us equally, which my brother struggled to accept. For someone so accustomed to being the center of attention, the perceived loss of favoritism was difficult for him to process. leading to frequent outbursts. My father, believing my brother was being mistreated by my mother and stepfather, made several attempts to gain full custody. However, his claims lacked evidence and were ultimately unsuccessful. Over time, these battles only served to deepen the divisions within our family. Reflecting on my wedding day, I can't help but see how my father's absence, and the reasons behind it, are emblematic of the larger dynamics that have shaped our family. While I strive to move forward with grace, this event has left me grappling with the weight of old wounds, the complexity of familial love, and the ever-present challenge of finding balance in relationships marked by conflict and history. I felt a sense of relief knowing my mother truly cared for me and that my stepfather was a kind and decent man. As a child, I struggled with conflicting emotions about my mother's affair, which ended her marriage to my father. Over time, I chose to focus on my happiness and maintained a close relationship with her, a decision I would cherish even more after losing her to cancer 4 years ago. The time we spent together became precious memories, and I came to appreciate her unwavering love despite the complexities of her personal life. In her final days, my brother visited rarely, but he made an effort to be there toward the end, bringing her some comfort. After her passing, my stepfather moved out of state, though we stayed in touch. A year later, my brother relocated to London for a job, visiting our father annually, and our communication dwindled to nearly nothing. As the years passed, the dynamics in my family began to shift, particularly between my father and me. He apologized for his distant behavior after the divorce, admitting that he had felt betrayed and hurt. He also confessed to favoring my brother, which strained our relationship. We agreed to work on improving our bond, and to my surprise, it began to heal. The change was so profound that I asked him to walk me down the aisle at my wedding, and he agreed. Despite this progress, I always felt like a secondary concern to my father, especially when my brother was around. My father's efforts to connect with me only seemed to happen in my brother's absence, a pattern that became glaringly obvious with a recent incident. He asked me to postpone my wedding so he could go on a last-minute camping trip with my brother. Hurt and frustrated, I called my stepdad and asked him to walk me down the aisle instead. My stepdad, who had been a supportive presence during my mother's funeral, hesitated at first, aware of the tension this could cause with my father. Eventually, he agreed. As my wedding day approached, my father became increasingly distant, preoccupied with my brother's visit. On the big day, he was absent, a painful yet unsurprising reality. I held out hope he might arrive at the last minute, but that hope faded as I walked down the aisle with my stepdad by my side, a moment that was both joyful and bittersweet. Later, I sent my father a photo from the ceremony, showing my stepdad escorting me. Hours passed without a response, but as the evening wound down, he unexpectedly appeared, exhausted and apologetic. He admitted he regretted not prioritizing my wedding and suggested holding a second ceremony so he could walk me down the aisle. His plea left me torn between hope for a new beginning and frustration over his thoughtlessness. As we spoke, it became clear his regret wasn't entirely about missing my wedding, it was also about being outshone by my stepdad. His desire for a second ceremony seemed driven more by pride than genuine care for me. Disappointed, I told him I wouldn't rearrange my special day for his benefit. His tears and apologies followed, but they couldn't erase the years of neglect and the hurt he caused with his choices. I stood firm, recounting the many times he had let me down, and explained why I couldn't overlook this latest betrayal. Despite his emotional display, I couldn't ignore the pattern of his behavior. My stepdad's presence at my wedding had been an act of love and support, while my father's was a history of performative affection and empty promises. Eventually, I left him outside, retreating to the peace of my home. He and my brother departed shortly after. In the time since that day, I've reflected on what happened. While part of me feels regret for the harsh words and the pain they caused, I find comfort in knowing I stood up for myself. My decision to have my stepdad walk me down the aisle wasn't just a reaction to my father's absence. It was a recognition of who had genuinely been there for me. Throughout my life, I've made countless excuses for my father's actions, but I've reached my limit. His behavior is inexcusable, and I no longer feel obligated to forgive him. It's painful to confront the truth about someone you love, but everyone has their breaking point. For years, I endured his neglect silently, hiding the tears he caused. Now, I'm finally prioritizing my own well-being, even if it means leaving him behind. I've made the difficult but necessary decision to cut off contact with my father for now, a choice I feel justified in making. My husband supports me fully, though he made it clear he wanted this decision to be entirely my own. I also shared my concerns with my stepdad, worried that I had unintentionally used him as a pawn in my issues with my father. He reassured me, acknowledging the strength of our relationship, which brought me comfort. To anyone concerned about my stepdad's feelings, he has expressed no resentment, which eases my mind. In the days since my wedding, my father has reached out repeatedly, but I've chosen not to respond. I haven't read his messages, preferring to focus on the upcoming honeymoon and this new chapter of my life. When he called again this morning, I considered checking his messages, but decided against it. I didn't want his words to disrupt the peace I'm trying to build as I embark on this special journey with my husband. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me, and I reviewed the messages. They were heartfelt and apologetic, each conveying his regret for failing as a father. He admitted he had favored my brother over the years and acknowledged the validity of my grievances. He expressed a desperate desire to mend our relationship, calling me his only remaining biological child and pleading for forgiveness. While his words stirred up complex emotions, I had already decided that I needed distance to heal. I called him back to make my position clear. He answered immediately, beginning to apologize, but I interrupted. I explained that his constant calls and messages were not helping. They only reopened wounds I was trying to close. I told him I was about to leave for my honeymoon and needed space. I promised to reach out when I was ready to reconnect, but until then, I asked him to respect my boundaries and refrain from contacting me. He agreed, hiding any hurt in his voice, and the conversation ended on a quiet, yet definitive, note. By the third day of my honeymoon, I was finally starting to feel at ease, but my peace was disrupted by an unexpected call from my brother, who used a burner phone to reach me. Initially, I wanted to hang up as soon as I heard his voice, but his accusations of me being an escapist kept me on the line. He criticized my treatment of our father, demanded I apologize, and lectured me on the importance of family. He argued that our father would always be part of my life and that my stepdad could never replace him. His words felt juvenile, as though we were still children caught in the fallout of our parents' divorce. When I explained this was a matter between me and our father, he insisted it affected the entire family. He claimed I had ruined his visit and cut short their camping trip, accusing me of acting out of jealousy. I told him his accusations were baseless and immature, pointing out that despite his professional success, he seemed stuck in our childhood dynamics. Before he could respond, I ended the call, feeling both a sense of relief and frustration. After returning from my honeymoon, I decided it was time to confront the lingering issues with my father. I visited him, surprising him and my brother, who was also present. Ignoring my brother's habitual interference, I requested a private conversation with my father, and after some reluctance, he agreed. I expressed my disappointment in his recent behavior, particularly his request to reschedule my wedding for a camping trip. I reminded him of the progress we'd made in our relationship over the years and how his actions had undermined that progress. I also questioned whether his absence stemmed from genuine priorities or a sense of competition with my stepdad. The conversation was difficult but necessary. My father expressed deep regret for missing my wedding, and I reassured him that dwelling on the past wouldn't help either of us. I told him I wasn't ready to sever ties permanently. Losing my mother to cancer taught me how fleeting life can be, and despite my father's faults, I still cherish the good memories we've shared. However, I also emphasized that I needed time to heal. I explained that rebuilding our relationship would take time, possibly weeks, months, or even years, and I needed him to respect my space in the meantime. He agreed, asking if he could hug me before I left. We shared a brief, emotional embrace, and I managed to hold back tears until I was alone in my car. This isn't an ending, but rather a pause, a chance for both of us to reflect, heal, and decide how to move forward.
I never intended to hide my success. Life has an uncanny way of revealing people's true colors when they believe you have nothing to offer. My name is Emma Chin, and I've always known that appearances can deceive. Growing up in a modest apartment above my parents' tiny grocery store in San Francisco's Chinatown, I watched them pour their lives into 14-hour workdays just to ensure there was food on our table and a chance for me to succeed. Their lessons shaped me. True worth isn't measured by wealth, but by character and determination. Emma, mai tin du shaik sin digi hui, my mother would say every morning as she straightened my collar, her hands worn from labor but tender as silk. Each day is a new opportunity. While my peers were playing video games or watching TV, I was helping stock shelves, learning inventory management, and poring over accounting books. My father's old calculator became my toy, and numbers my steadfast companion. But beyond the math, I absorbed the ethos of their work: respect every customer, no matter what they could afford. Treat everyone like family, my father would say. You never know their story. Their sacrifices bore fruit when I earned a full scholarship to Stanford's business school. The day I received my acceptance letter, my mother cried, and my father closed the store early for the first time in 2 decades. We celebrated with a feast of dumplings and my mother's special red bean soup. At Stanford, I worked relentlessly, channeling the grit my parents had instilled in me. Between classes, I developed an innovative supply chain management system that caught the eye of Genesis Tech, a rising Silicon Valley powerhouse. Your algorithm could transform global distribution. Marcus Sterling, their CEO, said during my final presentation. We'd love for you to join us after graduation. The offer was beyond anything I'd imagined. A senior position with significant stock options. But I surprised Marcus by requesting to start in operations instead, learning the business from the ground up, just like I had in my parents' store. Most people want to start at the top, Marcus remarked, his curiosity piqued. I want to earn it, I replied. How can I lead if I don't understand the foundations? Impressed, he agreed. Officially, I was Senior Vice President of Operations, but few colleagues knew my true title, a secret I preferred. That's how I met James. One rainy Tuesday morning in the company cafeteria, I was immersed in inventory reports when someone jostled my table, nearly spilling my coffee. Oh no, I'm so sorry. A tall man with kind eyes and a crooked tie scrambled to steady the cup. I swear, I'm usually more coordinated. Laughing, I replied, no harm done. I'm Emma. James Wilson. His warm smile tugged at something in me. Let me make it up to you. Coffee's on me. One coffee led to lunch, then dinner, and soon we were inseparable. James worked in marketing, his creative flair complementing my analytical nature. He loved hearing about my work in operations, always curious about my day. You don't just see problems, he said one evening as we strolled along the bay. You see solutions. When he proposed 6 months later, I said yes without hesitation. It wasn't until we began planning the wedding that I encountered his mother, Victoria Wilson. Our first meeting took place in their Pacific Heights mansion, a monument to old money. Victoria greeted me from atop a marble staircase, her demeanor icy. So, she began surveying me through designer glasses. You work in operations? She practically spat the word. Yes, I said evenly, offering no further explanation. And your parents? They own a grocery store in Chinatown. Small business owners, she murmured, exchanging a look with her husband. Well, everyone has to start somewhere. James squeezed my hand but said nothing. A red flag I chose to ignore. In the weeks leading up to our wedding, Victoria's subtle digs and overt meddling became routine. She dismissed my preferences as charmingly simple and insisted on orchestrating everything. Darling, she'd say, patting my hand as if consoling a child. Leave it to those who understand these things. Even my wedding dress, a modern design with traditional Chinese accents, became a point of contention. But dear at the street Francis, wouldn't you prefer something more appropriate? This is appropriate, I replied firmly. It honors both cultures. She pursed her lips. Well, I suppose it's your decision. Though James's first girlfriend, Caroline, always had such elegant taste. European, you know. James, yet again, said nothing. Despite Victoria's interference, the wedding was beautiful. My parents sat in the front row, tears glistening in their eyes. Meanwhile, Victoria held court, regaling her bridge club with tales of James' accomplished cousins. Of course, not everyone marries up, I overheard her say, her tone dripping with disdain. Post-wedding life didn't ease the tension. Monthly family dinners became tests of patience as Victoria's barbs continued. Emma, dear, could you help the housekeeper clear the table? You must feel more at home in the kitchen. Or, James, Caroline just made partner at her law firm. Isn't it inspiring when people reach their full potential? By Christmas, Victoria announced a grand holiday dinner, emphasizing, everyone who matters will be there. Everyone who matters, I echoed. Yes, well, you understand. Family. James stared into his wine glass, silent as always. What Victoria didn't know was that her Christmas dinner would unravel her assumptions in ways she could never predict. But that's a story for another time. We arrived at the Wilson mansion at exactly 6 o'clock. True to form, Victoria had spared no expense. Thousands of twinkling white lights adorned the three-story facade, and an enormous wreath with a gold bow graced the front door. Through the frosted windows, I glimpsed a dining room that looked like a luxury magazine spread, complete with towering floral arrangements and gleaming crystal. James, Emma, Victoria greeted us, her smile just as polished and cold as the silverware inside. She wore an elegant designer gown, undoubtedly more expensive than what she imagined I earned in a year. James, darling, everyone's gathered in the living room. Emma, perhaps you could lend a hand in the kitchen with the appetizers. Mom, James began, but I touched his arm lightly. It's fine, I said, my voice calm. Victoria's lips curled in a smug smile. So considerate. That's what we love about her, isn't it, James? Always willing to pitch in. James offered a weak laugh and followed her into the living room, leaving me alone in the hallway. In the kitchen, I found Maria, the Wilsons' housekeeper of 15 years, commanding a small team with the precision of a general. When she spotted me, her warm smile reached her eyes. Mrs. Emma, what are you doing in here? You're a guest. Apparently not, I replied with a wry smile. Still, I rolled up my sleeves and began helping her arrange the smoked salmon canapés. The doorbell chimed again, followed by Victoria's delighted exclamations as more guests arrived. Among the voices, one stood out, Caroline. Of course, James' ex-girlfriend had somehow found her way onto the guest list. When it was time for dinner, Maria and I carried the appetizers into the formal dining room. The sight that greeted me was as grand as I'd imagined. A massive table set for 24, each place adorned with Waterford crystal and antique silver. Name cards, written in Victoria's flowing calligraphy, marked every seat. I walked the perimeter of the table, scanning for my name. It wasn't there. Oh, Emma, Victoria's voice rang out, syrupy with fox concern. We're just a bit tight on space at the main table. I'm sure you understand. Family comes first. Why don't you join Maria in the kitchen? You two seem to get along so well. The room fell silent. Every eye turned to me, some curious, others uncomfortable. Caroline's smirk was barely concealed behind her champagne glass. James's father, Richard, cleared his throat. Perhaps we can fit another chair. Nonsense, Victoria interrupted smoothly. Emma understands. She's used to more casual settings. My cheeks burned, but I forced a neutral expression. Years of handling tough negotiations had taught me the value of composure. Of course, Victoria, whatever makes you comfortable. As I turned to leave, I caught James's gaze. He looked uneasy but said nothing. Something inside me hardened. Back in the kitchen, Maria wrung her hands. Mrs. Emma, this isn't right. Let me speak to Mrs. Wilson. It's fine, I said, pulling out my phone and sending a quick text. I sat at the small kitchen table and opened my laptop. At least let me fix you a plate, Maria insisted. Thank you, Maria, but I have some urgent work to handle. Major supply chain issue. I offered a reassuring smile as I reviewed the data Marcus had sent. The problems in Asia were more severe than I'd hoped, but not insurmountable. From the dining room came the sound of laughter and clinking glasses. Victoria's voice floated above the rest, recounting tales from James's childhood. Caroline chimed in with anecdotes from their high school days. 20 minutes passed, then 30. The doorbell rang again. Maria moved to answer it, but I stopped her. That's for me. I opened the door to find Marcus Sterling, CEO of Genesis Tech, standing in his signature tailored suit, a look of mild concern on his face. Emma, he greeted me warmly. Apologies for intruding on your Christmas dinner, but we need your input on the Asia situation. Of course, I said, gesturing for him to come in. Though technically, I'm not at the dinner table. His brow furrowed. Not at the table. Why not? Why don't we find out together? We walked into the dining room, where the hum of conversation stopped abruptly. 24 heads swiveled toward us, curiosity and confusion etched on their faces. Victoria stood quickly, her expression hard to read. I'm so sorry, sir. The help isn't supposed to let visitors in unannounced. Emma, you should know better. Marcus blinked, then turned to me. Help? I'm confused. Why is my senior vice president of operations eating in the kitchen? The silence was deafening. Victoria's face drained of color. Senior. Vice president? Yes, Marcus said, oblivious to, or perhaps enjoying, the tension. Emma's leadership has been pivotal to Genesis Tech's success. Her supply chain system is groundbreaking. Surely her husband has mentioned her accomplishments. All eyes turned to James, who looked like he might faint. I didn't know, he stammered. You never asked, I said quietly. Caroline's champagne flute slipped from her hand, shattering against the hardwood floor. No one moved to clean it up. But you work in operations, Victoria sputtered. You said. I do, I replied, my tone calm. As the senior vice president, I chose to start at the ground level, just as my parents did in their modest grocery store. Marcus nodded approvingly. Speaking of which, Emma, your mother's dumplings are extraordinary. The board loved them at our last meeting. Victoria collapsed into her chair, her shock plain. Board meetings? Yes. Marcus continued. Emma's one of our youngest board members. Her stock options alone are worth. Marcus, I interjected gently. Perhaps we should handle the Asia situation elsewhere. I wouldn't want to disrupt the family dinner. I turned to Victoria, my gaze steady. Thank you for making my place in this family so abundantly clear. It's helped me make some important decisions. Emma, wait, James said, finally standing. We need to talk about this. We do, I agreed. But not tonight. Tonight, I have a company to run. As I left, I paused. Oh, and Victoria, those dumplings you dismissed last month, they were a hit at our last gala, $200 per plate, quite the success with the governor. Marcus and I walked out into the crisp night air. As we approached his car, he glanced at me. I've been wondering how long you'd let them treat you like that. I smiled faintly. Sometimes it's better to let people show you who they really are. And James, that's a decision for another day. As the car pulled away, my phone buzzed relentlessly with messages. From James, from Richard, even one from Caroline. But the one from Victoria stood out. Emma, dear, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I turned off my phone. Asia needed my attention, and my life needed a fresh perspective. As my mother always said, each day is a new opportunity, and tonight, I'd seized mine. The next morning, I woke up in my private office at Genesis Tech, the resolution to the Asia crisis neatly tucked away in my outbox. A late-night video conference with our Shanghai partners and decisive action had steered the company away from disaster. As sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, a knock on the door pulled me from my thoughts. Mrs. Chen. Sarah, my assistant, peeked in. Your husband is in the lobby. Again. This is his third attempt since dawn. I sighed and glanced at my phone. 47 missed calls, 93 texts, and an avalanche of emails. Victoria alone had sent 28 increasingly frantic messages. Send him up, Sarah. It's time we talked. When James walked in, he looked nothing like his usual polished self. His hair was messy, his shirt wrinkled, and his tie was nowhere to be seen. His eyes darted around the room, taking in the sleek office, the awards on the walls, and the panoramic view of the bay. Emma, he began, his voice hesitant. This is really your office. For the past 2 years, I replied, motioning for him to sit. Not that you ever asked. He sank into one of the visitor chairs, his gaze dropping. I don't understand. Why didn't you tell me? Tell you what? That I'm more than the girl your mother looks down on. That I've built a career while you stood by and said nothing. When exactly was I supposed to do that, James? In between your mother's jabs or your silence? He winced. Mom's difficult. Difficult? I repeated, crossing my arms. She made me eat in the kitchen on Christmas, and you let her. I was going to say something. But you didn't. You never do. My voice was calm but firm. 2 years, James. 2 years of watching you laugh at your mother's jokes about my background. 2 years of staying silent while she paraded Caroline in front of me. 2 years of you being ashamed of me, or at least of what you thought I was. I wasn't ashamed, he protested. Weren't you? Then why didn't you ever ask about my work? Why didn't you visit me here? Why didn't you defend me? Before he could answer, my phone buzzed. Marcus's name appeared on the screen. The board approved your Asia strategy, he said. Stocks up 12% already. Excellent work. Thank you, Marcus. I'll finalize the timeline today. When I hung up, James stared at me, his face pale. You report directly to Marcus Sterling. I have for years, I said, my tone matter of fact. Remember last Christmas when I missed your mother's party because of overtime? I was in Tokyo, finalizing a billion-dollar deal, but you assumed I was working a shift at a warehouse. Emma, I didn't know, he pleaded. Please, give me another chance. I shook my head. That's the problem, James. Now that you know I'm successful, you want to make things right. What about when you thought I was just a grocery store girl? Didn't I deserve respect then? The silence between us was deafening, and in it, I found my answer. A knock on the door interrupted us. Sarah appeared again, looking uncomfortable. Mrs. Chen, Mrs. Wilson is here. She's insistent. I nodded. Send her in. Victoria swept in, dressed impeccably as always, though her usual composure was absent. Her eyes flitted around the room, widening as they landed on my credentials and accolades. Emma, darling, she began, her voice sticky sweet. We need to clear up this misunderstanding. Misunderstanding? I arched an eyebrow. You mean where you made me eat in the kitchen, or where you've spent 2 years treating me like I was beneath you? Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. I didn't know who you were. And that, I said sharply, is the root of the problem. You judge me based on my parents' grocery store. Tell me, Victoria, how much do you think Genesis Tech paid for my supply chain system? She blinked, floundering. I don't. $300 million, before I even graduated. That modest store taught me everything about respect and hard work, concepts you still haven't grasped. Emma, James interjected, people can change. Give us a chance to make this right. I opened my laptop, revealing an email from my lawyer. 2 years, James. Have given you plenty of chances. I met his gaze. I'm filing for divorce. Victoria gasped. You can't. Think of James's future. I am, and mine. I stood. The prenup you insisted on. It protects my assets as much as his, and the Pacific Heights mansion. I bought it last year. Check the property records. James sank back, stunned. All this time, while you let your mother belittle me, I was building something real. I pressed a button on my desk. Sarah, please escort Mrs. Wilson out. James, you have until Friday to move your things to your parents' house. Emma, think of what people will say, Victoria exclaimed as security arrived. They'll say what I should have said years ago. Respect isn't earned by a bank account. It's earned by treating people with dignity. I turned to James. Your mother spent 2 years trying to make me feel small. She only succeeded in showing me how small she is. As they left, I stood by the window, watching the fog roll over the bay. A text from my mother appeared on my phone. Mai tan du shaik sin de jihui. Each day is a new opportunity. Smiling, I drafted a press release about Genesis Tech's triumph. The stock would close at a record high that day. But my true success wasn't in the numbers. It was in knowing I'd reclaimed my self-worth. 6 months later, I closed another quarterly report. The divorce was final, the house sold, and Victoria had a new cautionary tale for her bridge club. None of it mattered anymore. Sarah knocked. Mrs. Chen, your parents are here for lunch. I closed my laptop, smiling. Success isn't about proving others wrong. It's about proving yourself right. And the best revenge? It's not served cold in a kitchen. It's served in a corner office, surrounded by those who saw your worth all along.